support and assistance to individuals to help them back into employment.
Thank you. That concludes questions. And the next item of business this afternoon is a statement by Keith Brown on making the most of Scotland's canals. The Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions, and I will allow a few seconds for members to change seats. I call on Keith Brown. Minister, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am grateful for the opportunity to make this statement setting out the Scottish Government's strategy for our canals. Our 5 canals are some of the most famous and historic canals in Britain, being built between 1768 and 1822 as transport routes. Each canal is unique with its own characteristics. And looking at our canals today, it is easy to forget the poor condition that these canals were in only 20 years ago and the very uncertain future that they faced. The Caledonian Canal was facing closure with bulging and leaking lock walls, and a 10-year £20 million lock stabilisation project secured its future. The Forth and Clyde and Union Canals became derelict following the closure in the 1960s, with calls for them to be filled in. Instead, they reopened in 2001 as part of the £78 million Millennium Link project, the largest canal restoration ever in Britain. The iconic Falkirk Wheel was constructed, reconnecting those 2 canals. In 2011, we protected that investment and subsequent investment by placing a statutory obligation on British Waterways to maintain the canals in a suitable condition for use by cruising craft. As scheduled monuments, the canals are now not only recognised as part of Scotland's rich heritage, but safeguarded for generations to come. They are no longer shunned by their communities, but well-loved resources. Partnership working, especially between Scottish Canals and local authorities, has been critical in recognising and realising the additional benefit our canals can offer, and I commend the partnerships which have been formed. These demonstrate that wider benefits to canal-side communities can be secured in addition to benefits for the canal itself. Scottish ministers gained responsibility for Scotland's canals in 2001. British Waterways continued as a cross-border body, but receiving policy direction and funding from the Scottish Government for its Scottish activities. Over £150 million in grant and aid since 2001 has allowed it to meet statutory duties and progress new initiatives. This direct investment acted as a stimulus for other public and private sector investment. In January, we allocated £4.6 million to Scottish Canals for shovel-ready infrastructure projects, in addition to the previously announced annual grant and aid of £10 million. In 2010, the UK Government decided to transfer the canals in England and Wales to a waterways charity, and British Waterways Chair suggested that our canals might also transfer. However, there was no appetite for such a change amongst Scottish stakeholders, and we were not persuaded that it would be in Scotland's best interests, so we decided to retain our canals in the public sector. We worked closely with the UK Government and British Waterways to ensure that both governments' decisions were implemented smoothly, with Scottish interests protected and preparatory work undertaken to allow British Waterways Scotland to operate on a self-standing basis. Issues such as changes in legislation, the cost of change itself, the fair split of assets, liabilities and pensions were all addressed. We adopted, I believe, a business-like approach which culminated in the successful separation of the 2 bodies last July. The British Waterways body continues to exist, though now as a Scottish public body known as Scottish Canals. This significant milestone means we now have a board appointed by Scottish ministers, and the policies and activities of Scottish Canals are determined solely by Scottish considerations, and that stands us in very good stead for moving forward. And that successful change, the management of that change, is, I believe, emblematic of what can be achieved. It demonstrates that, though challenging, with goodwill and hard work, it is perfectly feasible for Scottish and UK ministers to work jointly to separate out functions where this is desired. In this case, after almost 50 years of cross-border operation, perhaps that is a case study for the future. A year ago, I advised the incoming board that I expected Scottish Canals to contribute strongly to the Scottish Government's primary purpose. I recognised that a priority for the board was to take stock of the assets and liabilities, inherited projects, policies and, of course, the risks. and the board has been heavily occupied with this, but is now ready to launch its vision and values for the organisation. Scotland's first canal policy document was published in 2002, and that explored the potential contribution of the canals, setting out the long-term vision at a time when restoration was underway. It identified that policy decisions on regeneration, on planning and development, public access, integrated transport, environment and tourism could potentially have a significant impact on the canal's sustainable development. Partnership working, especially with the public sector, was seen as key. There was a need to increase awareness of the canals and to promote voluntary sector and community involvement. And that policy document stood the test of time well. Given the successful transition to Scottish Canals, this is a good time, I believe, to restate our aspirations. Our new policy is set at a strategic level, taking the canals forward for the next 5 to 10 years. Our canals are important assets that we wish to see utilised in order to enhance the future quality of life for Scotland's inhabitants and to help create a more successful, sustainable country. We look to build on the successful start made in revitalising our canals and in gaining wider public benefits from them. We encourage their full and sustainable development in a way that impacts positively. And this can be done by continuing to develop the role canals, both urban and rural canals, can play in delivering wider public benefits and by working in strong partnerships to secure those benefits. So I have encouraged Scottish Canals and its partners, whether public sector, private sector or third sector, to continue to build on relationships and to identify and exploit new contributions from canals in the delivery of the Scottish Government's purpose. We expect Scottish Canals to continue to lead in development of the canals, taking full account of the role and the legitimate interests of the Scottish Government. Scottish Canals will continue to receive government grant, but they are also encouraged to develop earned income streams. And the strategy for achieving our aims is based on the following principles. First of all, valuing the heritage of our canals, preserving them in a good condition, ensuring their integrity and the appearance of these historic structures are maintained. Development itself should not damage nor detract from the original design. Fulfilling statutory and regulatory obligations, these have to be met as a fundamental responsibility, with proper resources applied to ensure safe navigation for leisure and freight as appropriate. Other regulations, of course, ensure that the natural environment is protected and used wisely. Risk management and safety. There is, of course, an inherent risk associated with water-based infrastructure assets. Scottish Canals should apply the highest possible standards of care to the management of all canal operations to ensure risks to the public are properly managed. Equally, the public should use the canals in a responsible manner. Increasing the awareness of the canal's potential contribution, we would like to see further growth in the numbers of boats navigating our canals. We also place a great value on the cross-cutting opportunities that the canal corridors present. Scottish Canals should therefore continue to build on the foundations laid, maintaining a balanced portfolio of projects across a range of important areas such as navigation, tourism, regeneration and housing, and freight and renewables. It should spread activity across the canals. It should utilise its resources wisely over time, balancing both risk and reward in line with the Government's objectives. We also ask that Scottish Canals deliver a high-quality experience, offering high-quality services and adopting an open and honest approach to engaging with customers and stakeholders. The significant increase in use of the canal network for recreational purposes, whilst welcome, can of course lead to tensions. There is, though, no hierarchy of use in the canal corridors, with fair and open access to all exercising permitted types of use. We also ask Scottish Canals to work through partnership and collaboration. Extensive partnership and collaborative working should continue both at the national and the local level to maintain the momentum which has been built up. And finally, monitoring and measuring outcomes. We encourage effective monitoring and the measuring of outcomes achieved, so that the benefit gained from initiatives can be assessed and demonstrated, and of course that will inform future decisions. So on that note, Presiding Officer, I invite members to read our new policy document, Making the Most of Scotland's Canals. This is available both on the Transport Scotland website and in Spice. I'd also encourage members to attend this evening's reception on Scottish Canals, hosted by my colleague Stuart McMillan. That will take place tonight in the Garden Lobby. I think it's been demonstrated that Scotland's canals are a great national asset, and their revival offers real opportunities not only for recreation and regeneration, but for the wider economy as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I now ask members who would like to ask questions on the statement to press the request to speak buttons, and Elaine Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I start by thanking the Minister for the advance copy of his statement and the strategy document. Now, Scottish Canals issued a draft consultation in November 2012, which stated that the finalised heritage strategy would be available by the 31st of January, and that document does not seem to have materialised. So can the Minister advise whether the document issued today includes the response to that consultation, and if it does, why the action plan for 2013 to 18 and its 20 specific objectives has not been included? If it doesn't include that, can he also otherwise advise when the finalised detailed strategy will actually be published? Can the Minister also advise whether the actions on communications, training, educational opportunities, knowledge transfer and, very importantly, funding and fundraising, which the consultation document anticipated would have commenced by now, are actually underway? And can the Minister indicate whether government funding additional to the annual budget of Scottish Canals of £10 million has been allocated to the strategy, and if so, what other organisations have been identified as being partners in the implementation of the strategy?
Thank you, Minister.
Can I thank the member for the questions which are raised? I think much of that has been covered in the initial statement, but can I say that in relation to the additional partners, funding partners, I think I've mentioned a number of those. Scottish Canals work with additional partners, including some of the stakeholders who are most interested in the canal network, to encourage further funding. The £10 million that was allocated grant and aid. That's been bolstered by a further £4.6 million over £3.3 million for this year and the remainder for the previous year. In relation to the strategy, can I say that events have kind of overtaken that previous proposal in as far as the structural changes which I've mentioned. But if there are any parts of this strategy which she would like more information of, I'm more than happy to get that from officials and pass that on to her. But I do think that the strategy that's been proposed here today by Scottish Canals covers the most important aspects of it in terms of funding, in terms of use of the canals and in terms of future strategy. It will, of course, be the case if we can identify further funding. That additional £4.6 million which I mentioned was shovel-ready funding, which we managed to get to Scottish Canals fairly quickly. If we can access further funding, then it will be directed towards Scottish Canals, and as has been discussed in the statement, the priority will be for those things which also increase regeneration, in particular in relation to housing opportunities at the canal side. So I think the funding situation is stable, and it's also one which has survived well in terms of the very constrained resources that we have. And I'm happy to provide any other information which the member wants that's not covered in the strategy.
Alec Johnson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I also thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement and congratulate him on having achieved a change in the structure of the body that looks after Scotland's canals through a process of evolution rather than revolution, and one which seems to have arrived at the satisfaction of most, if not all, of those involved. In fact, I note also that by us ensuring that Scottish Canals will continue to receive government funding, but encouraging them to develop earned income streams, the Minister may also have succeeded in the partial privatisation of the industry, which I would also congratulate him for. However, while having dealt with the key issues of ongoing funding, I am concerned that the prospect of economic sustainability in the medium to long term will require substantial capital investment, as has been the case in the past 10 years. So can the Minister tell me if the structure which he has now achieved will be appropriate in order to attract adequate levels of substantial capital investment in the long term, or whether the Government itself plans to continue to be the main source of capital for the canal structures in Scotland?
Minister.
Can I thank Alec Johnson for his congratulations on achieving the independent status of Scottish Canals. It's not, of course, true to say there's any element of privatisation. Local authorities have earned sources of income, and that's all that we're asking for Scottish Canals to do. They'll do that not least through fees for people navigating the canal structure itself, which has always been the case. In relation to the sustainability of capital funding, that is an important point, not least because, of course, our capital budget has been cut by around a third, and that produces pressures for all aspects of government. But we have encouraged and will continue to encourage Scottish Canals to work in partnership with other agencies. In particular, if you look at the projects in Glasgow, that's been done working with private sector agencies and also with local authorities as well. We'll encourage that as best we can, and obviously the more that we can do that, we think there are some substantial gains for Scottish Canals, canal users, and also those that might want to invest along the canal side in particular to bring funding into that. The more we can do that, then the more benefit we can see. And of course, the less that the government has to commit to that, then obviously that allows us to invest those resources elsewhere. But we're not going to leave the canals to get back into the situation we were, say, 20 years ago. We will intend to continue to invest in the canals to make sure that the progress which has been achieved is continued, but at the same time look to bring on other sources of funding, as we should do.
Thank you. Dave Thompson.
The Minister will know that the Caledonian Canal is hugely important to my constituency for both commerce and tourism.
Sorry, Mr Thompson, could you pull your microphone round?
My apologies. The Minister will know that the Caledonian Canal is hugely important to my constituency, especially in relation to both commerce and tourism, and I will be attending the canal reception this evening in the Parliament. Could I also commend the Scottish Government and Scottish Canals on the investment on the Caledonian Canal in recent years. However, these improvements must continue if we are really to reap the real benefits from the canals in our country. So can the Minister tell us, in a bit more detail possibly, what he is going to do to encourage further growth in the number of vessels navigating our canals, and particularly the Caledonian Canal?
Minister.
I can thank Dave Thompson for this question. The policy that's been set out does demonstrate the wish to see further growth in the number of boats navigating our canals, and it does try to encourage canals, boaters and other parties to work together towards exploiting the opportunities to achieve this. Perhaps two of the examples which may be applicable, of course, in different forms to the Caledonian Canal are those which are currently happening at the Forth and Clyde Canal. We've got, first of all, the issue of access, making sure that access is as easy as possible through the overcoming the issue of the narrow tidal access in relation to the Forth and Clyde Canal. That offers an opportunity to encourage more transit across the canals. There is an increasing appetite for people to use the canal, so I think in relation to the Caledonian Canal as well, I think we want to make sure that access is made as easy as possible for people, and also other opportunities. We are looking at opportunities for people living by the canal side. There's a great level of interest in that, but not as many opportunities. So trying to increase these opportunities will also see increased use of the canals, including the Caledonian Canal.
Thank you. Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The canal network was, of course, originally built to help to support the economy in our country, and it is very satisfactory to note that in constituencies like mine, the creative industries, sporting activities and regeneration are now being sparked off by the catalyst that is the Forth and Clyde Canal. But I note in the Minister's statement that he indicated that the Scottish Canals would continue to receive government grant, but that they would be encouraged to develop earned income streams. And I wondered if he'd like to say a little bit more about what those earned income streams might be, and also whether the Scottish Government has a view as to the balance between grant funding from the Scottish Government and money as a result of those particular income streams.
Minister.
I don't think there's a fixed view on what the balance should be. I think we would obviously want to try and maximise the other earned income streams. They can come from a number of resources, and they can be both revenue and capital. I've mentioned a couple of times already the issue of housing. If we can develop housing opportunities, perhaps with others contributing towards that investment, possibly through other arms of government, possibly through social or private providers as well, then we can see increased income coming into the Scottish Canals through that route. But obviously we're seeing also, not least in the member's own constituency, and I know that she's put two motions to the Parliament on the developments in her area, and she will know full well the different uses which people are now looking at in terms of canals, water-based and also shore-based activities. People, whether it's canoeing, whether it's boating, there's a great interest in this. If we can continue to maximise that interest, and of course in some cases that will mean there's a revenue accruing to Scottish Canals, and that will increase the revenue that they have, and perhaps either reduce the dependency on government funding or add to it such that we can do even more on the canals.
Thank you. Linda Fabiani.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister may well be aware of the content of a recent meeting of the Cross-Party Group on Architecture and Built Environment, which was about learning from Norway's use of high-quality architecture to punctuate the country's main tourist routes. It would seem to me that the Canal Strategy is an ideal opportunity in the Year of Natural Scotland to utilise architectural competition to give young architects much-needed experience to quickly procure small capital projects and enhance our tourism offering. In that, project like this would meet the 7 principles outlined in the Minister's statement. I wonder if he would give it due consideration. Minister.
I think that's a very good point, because we've also found in relation to active travel, walking and cycling, that where we are involved in small capital projects, they tend to have a disproportionate benefit in local areas. They employ, it tends to be more people because of the small nature of them, and it has, as I say, a disproportionate benefit to local areas. So small projects, small capital projects are something we want to see encouraged. We're already working to exploit the potential for small capital projects in the canal system. Some examples of that would include regeneration initiatives, the rural housing which I've mentioned, holiday cottages, camping pods, on which we've had a recent announcement, and also the exploration of small-scale hydro schemes. Our canals are extremely important for tourism, whether that's heritage boating, paddling, walking, cycling, or through visitor attractions such as the Falkirk Wheel, which I've mentioned, and Neptune Staircase. So the scope for canals to strengthen Scotland's tourism offer is considerable. But the policy document itself makes clear that Scottish Canals, coming back to the point of Linda Fabiani, will work in partnership to take advantage of such opportunities to maximise the number of small capital projects that they're involved in.
Thank you. Fiona McLeod.
Pleased to hear the Minister more than once mention housing, and I understand that it's at Principle 4. I want to talk about a rather different form of housing than the Minister, I think, has been alluding to. I understand that Scottish Canals are planning to have houseboats at Kirkintilloch Marina in my constituency, and I was wondering if any consideration had been given to whether these boats meet the criteria for affordable housing needs.
Minister.
Yes, having looked at this initiative recently, I think it's also the case, and I could be proven wrong, that they don't attract council tax, which is another thing which makes them perhaps more affordable. But the canals, Scottish Canals generally are planning to have houseboats, as the member mentions, at Kirkintilloch Marina. In January, I allocated around £4.6 million, as I mentioned, to Scottish Canals for shovel-ready projects, and that included support for Living on the Water initiative, with Kirkintilloch being one of the locations that Scottish Canals are exploring. The initiative itself is still at an early stage, but I can see potential for it to contribute towards the targets mentioned by the member, since living on a boat can be an extremely affordable option, especially in urban areas.
Thank you. Tavish Scott.
Presiding Officer, can I thank the Minister for an advance copy of his statement and agree with his point that capital investment in Scottish Canals has certainly taken off since 2001, having had some years of neglect before that. He might also share my view that Neptune's staircase is indeed one of the engineering wonders of the world, and many great achievements have gone on in the canal network because of the engineering expertise grown over that time. Does he have any reflections on point 5 in his strategy in relation to delivering a high-quality experience on the self-operation of lochs? My recollection from a previous life is that there was a considerable case made by active users of our canal network to ensure that they could use the lochs after a certain period of night when they were normally closed because of the scheduling of those arrangements. Has there been any progress on that matter, and therefore to encourage more people, as he rightly said, to use the canals?
Minister.
Can I agree with the member's description of Neptune Staircase as a real wonder? It's something else I tend to go back to this summer to have a closer look at once again. In relation to boaters and others, canal users, using the lochs themselves, I've had a fairly traumatic experience using the lochs myself on the Crinning Canal, so I think there has to be some care taken in terms of especially novice users of the system to make sure that there's no long-term damage to the canal, if I can put it that way. So that kind of decision as to whether it could be made available outside of the hours which Scottish Canal staff work in, I think would be best taken by Scottish Canal staff themselves. They're the experts in this area. They'll also have a fair idea of the clientele who are using the lochs as well, but it's a fair point. I'll look further into that and get back to Tavish Scott on that.
Thank you. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Minister, only 2 weeks ago I visited Bowling Basin and could see that the huge opportunity that exists there to help regenerate the site, which would have a wider economic return. What assistance can the Scottish Government provide to Scottish-Canals to actually help turn the Bowling Basin in Western Bartonshire into yet another first-class marine-based location on the River Clyde?
Minister.
I think I've laid out perhaps the more general assistance that we've offered. I mentioned the £4.6 million to Scottish Canals for shovel-ready projects. That included a project to refurbish the Issues Railway Bridge at Bowling to create a new pedestrian cycle link and to provide commercial space in the arches. Residential moorings are also proposed as part of the recently launched Living on Water initiative, which that funding also supported. As I've said before, Scottish Canals are working with the local authority and community on a master plan for a mixed-use development. This happens across Scotland, but it's particularly relevant in relation to Bowling, and that embraces the marine economy and the local housing demand. I think it's tapping into that huge attraction there is amongst people to live by the water. So the potential of the maritime leisure industry is clear. Our canals promote vital connections, of course, to our sailing waters as well. I mentioned the Crinan Canal. It's true in relation to that especially. So I expect Scottish Canals to play a full part in that kind of development, not least in the development at Bowling, as mentioned by the member.
And finally, Gil Patterson.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. The Minister will be aware that there has been significant investment and great work on the Clyde and Forth Canal over recent years, especially in the section of the canal that passes through Clydebank in my constituency. I'd be grateful if you could inform the Parliament on what has been done to attract more volunteers to become more involved with the canal to ensure that we maximise on its potential and it continues to go from strength to strength.
Minister.
I think the member quite rightly identifies the Forth and Clyde Canal as being the one where some really exciting developments have taken place over the last decade or so. I remember being there on the day that the Falkirk Wheel was opened, but also some of the developments which are happening in Grangemouth just now at the other end of the canal from the members' area, again, are very exciting. There are a number of volunteer organisations based on the canal system, and they can make a real difference to people's lives. A number of these canals-based volunteer organisations have come together to form the Lowland Canal Volunteer Group to coordinate activity and to maximise opportunities, and I would encourage anyone with an interest to get involved with the group. Scottish Canals and the Scottish Waterways Trust are also fully aware of the potential for volunteering on the canal system. Progress is being made in this. As I say, I would encourage all those who might have an interest to come along and get involved.
Thank you. That concludes the statement on making the most of Scotland's canals. And we now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number S4M 06306 in the name of Lewis MacDonald on access to justice. Can I invite those members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now? I should also remind the Chamber that debates in the afternoon are follow-on debates and don't have set times. I now call on Lewis MacDonald to speak to and move the motion. Mr MacDonald, you have 14 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. We have brought this debate today to allow all members to have a say in the closures and cuts in function of Scotland's courts, cuts and closures which were fully and formally supported by Kenny MacAskill on behalf of the Scottish Government last Friday morning. These proposals will, of course, be subject to scrutiny by the Justice Committee, but that procedure will only allow MSPs to express a collective view if the Justice Committee then votes to reject the statutory instruments in question. So today, members have the opportunity to stand up and be counted and tell ministers what they think of Mr MacAskill's cuts and closures plan, whether or not they have a vote themselves on the Justice Committee. Now, the Scottish Government has made no secret of the fact that these plans are about reducing the budget of Scotland's courts, regardless of the delays and inefficiencies from which many of them already suffer. As the Chief Executive of the Court Service said 2 weeks ago, by 2015, the Court Service running cost budget will reduce by 20% in real terms, and the capital budget will reduce from 20 million to 4 million. Brian Carroll, Secretary of the Scottish Courts branch of PCS, made the same point. These proposals are about fitting the delivery of justice into a reduced budget, and nothing to do with modernisation or with the proposed justice reforms that are under consideration presently. Kenny MacAskill has not denied that money is at the root of these proposals, but his amendment today seeks, I suppose, predictably, to place all of the blame for those cuts on Westminster. Yet this, of course, is the same Justice Secretary who failed last year to avoid the single Scottish Police and Fire Services becoming liable to pay VAT at a cost to those services of well over £20 million a year. Those are cuts the police and fire services cannot afford, as hundreds of police staff who fear for their future could testify. But for Kenny MacAskill to say that he can afford to take a £24 million hit to the police service but cannot avoid cuts of £1 million a year to Scotland's courts simply lacks credibility. These are Kenny MacAskill's cuts and closures, and to pretend somebody else is responsible for his decisions is an insult to all those who stand to lose access to local justice. If members are unsure about the Cabinet Secretary's personal responsibility for these decisions, they only have to consider the timetable. Reports of possible closures first emerged in December 2011. Service users were invited by the Scottish Court Service to take part in dialogue events in May 2012. The consultation on proposed closures was launched last September, and conclusions and final recommendations were published only on Tuesday, the 9th of April, barely 2 weeks ago. The Court Service, in other words, took well over a year from first consideration to get to final conclusions, recognising, no doubt, the seriousness of what they proposed. Not so the Justice Secretary. He did not need to think too much about the cuts and closures over which the Court Service had taken so much time, because in the truth these are Kenny MacAskill's cuts, not the Court Service's. Take just one issue, the impact of closure proposals on the local economy of the towns in question, raised, for example, by Andy Willocks of the Federation of Small Businesses. The FSB very fairly acknowledged that wider economic impact was not a primary responsibility of the Scottish Court Service, but rather a primary responsibility of the Scottish Government. They noted that Nicola Sturgeon had launched the Town Centre Review on behalf of the Scottish Government by saying, "We want to take every measure possible to ensure our high streets are vibrant places where local people want to spend their time and money." Indeed, many SNP members have signed up to oppose the closure of Crown Post offices in today's members' debate for that very reason. Many have also signed up to oppose closure of their local courts. So I asked Kenny MacAskill last week if he would take into account the impact of court closures on the local economy of county towns before reaching any final decisions. Yes, he said, these are matters that I will discuss with Cabinet colleagues. That was on Tuesday. He announced his decision on Friday. Well, that must have been some discussion. Perhaps Kenny MacAskill will tell us today whether he has met formally with the Deputy First Minister and with other Cabinet colleagues since he made that commitment in Parliament last Tuesday afternoon. Perhaps he will tell us what consideration of the wider policy context there was between Tuesday and Friday of last week, as urged by the FSB. Anyone with an interest, the FSB said on Friday, anyone with an interest in the economic well-being of Scotland's towns will question the Justice Secretary's decision. And they said that decision should be revisited. Of course.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can the member tell me what businesses were lost in the town of Linlithgow when the court was closed in Linlithgow and moved to Livingston?
As Mr MacAskill is a native of Linlithgow and I am not, I am sure members will recognise that as an entirely rhetorical question. What I would say to him is that, for example, the chairman of the Easter Ross branch of the FSB said that he was disappointed that the Court Service had taken no account of local economic impact and that he hoped the Justice Secretary would take a different approach. Well, Mr MacAskill has demonstrated that he has not taken a different approach.
Neil Findlay.
Could I suggest that Mr MacDonald and Mr MacAskill speak to the traders in Linlithgow to see if the removal of the courts from Linlithgow was a good move?
Lewis MacDonald.
That sounds like an excellent idea, and I'm sure if Mr MacAskill doesn't manage it, I'm sure Mr Findlay will. Economic impact is reason enough to have brought this debate. Kenny MacAskill, in our view, has moved with unseemly haste to confirm his commitment to these cuts and closures. He has not had time to consider their wider economic impact, far less to address the many other issues raised, which Mr MacAskill cannot have fully considered between Tuesday and Friday of last week. For example, in the Highlands, concerns were raised about the high costs of police officers having to travel far further to give evidence if local sheriff courts were closed and High Court cases were transferred from Inverness to Aberdeen. It would be an utter nonsense, said the Press and Journal last Friday, to save money on the court system if it ends up with police officers being removed from duty more often as a consequence. Ministers, said the editorial of the newspaper, have to look at this issue in the whole, rather than on a piecemeal departmental approach, which seems to be the focus at the moment, of course.
Cabinet Secretary.
It might surprise the member, but I met both with ASPS and indeed the Scottish Police Federation today. David O'Connor, the Chief Superintendent and Chair of the Association of Police Superintendents, is perfectly relaxed and supportive of these closures. The police do not seem to have the position being taken by Mr MacDonald.
Liz MacDonald.
Well, that's very interesting. I'm glad Mr McCaskill is finally getting round to meeting some people from the police service several days after making the decision that he made. But let's consider, for example, Stonehaven. In that town, the police service and the court service, very sensibly, share a building at the heart of the town. The Police Service of Scotland, again, told the press 10 days ago there is no suggestion that the police office will be closed or sold. But at the same time, the court service told the same newspaper, should Stonehaven Sheriff Court close, then SCS will market the court building. Any other proposal for the area where the police is located is entirely a matter for Police Scotland. There we have it. Kenny McCaskill decides to close the local court. The closure of the local court results in the closure of the local police station, although nobody bothers to tell the police force. The closure of the local court and the local police station will reduce local access to justice and have a major impact on the local economy. But Mr McCaskill does not appear to think that the impact on the local economy is any of his business, and he doesn't appear to talk to the police service about the impact of his decisions on their deployment of resources in the towns affected. And what is true of Stonehaven is true of town after town across Scotland. The government decides, and everyone else has to cope with the consequences, intended or otherwise. Austin Lafferty, President of the Law Society, said last week he was disappointed and concerned by Mr McCaskill's decision to press on and close every single court on the list. Local courts are an integral part of communities across Scotland, he said. We do not believe closures on this scale are compatible with the commitment the government has expressed on widening access to justice, and this closure programme will fail to achieve significant financial savings in the long term. Even with the introduction of video conference links, it is likely that some of the remaining courts, which are already at capacity, will struggle with the level of additional business, which in turn could slow down proceedings and increase cost. That view of the Law Society is reflected in submission after submission to the court service consultation, as other members will no doubt spell out this afternoon. Douglas Cuisine, a retired sheriff in the North East, said, for example, there must be a serious doubt about the claim that the Sheriff Court in Aberdeen could accommodate the staff and the business displaced by the proposed closure of Stonehaven, given the cramped conditions already in Aberdeen. David Hingston, former Procurator Fiscal and local solicitor, described the proposal to close Dingwall Sheriff Court as moronic because it failed to take account of the position at Inverness. All too frequently, he said, trials in Inverness are put off because of a lack of time to hear them on the date fixed. Add the Dingwall caseload, in his view, and the current delay of 3 months for trials could double. And justice delayed is justice denied. Mr Cuisine and Mr Hingston are powerful witnesses, and it is because of such consequences that public opinion is so much against Mr McCaskill's plans, and that, of course, includes many in his own party. I enjoyed a television debate only a few minutes ago with Christine Graham. She told the Peoplesshire News earlier this month, as she told the BBC a moment ago, that she would continue to oppose closure of Peebles Sheriff Court. She urged people to write to her as convener of the Justice Committee, saying, I know that many of those on this committee are unhappy about some of the proposals, of course.
And as I also said, the member kindly quoted me there, I also continue to say, and if I couldn't get that resisted, I would be certainly campaigning and ensuring there was a justice centre in the Scottish borders in Galashiels, and that was my bottom line.
Absolutely, that is indeed what Christine Graham said. And of course the point is that Christine Graham, Roddy Campbell, who is sitting beside her, has expressed equal concerns about the impact of closure of the court at Cooper. Members of the Justice Committee can throw out these proposals. They have it in their power to vote them down and send them back to this chamber for decision. That is what they can do, and that, I believe, is what they should do. Because, of course, there are members of the SNP in the chamber today who are not on the Justice Committee, who also have a view. Dave Thompson, for example, told the Ross Shire Journal that he was extremely concerned by the proposal to close Dingwall Sheriff Court. Nigel Donn told the Mearns leader that the closure of courts such as Stonehaven is not yet a done deal, and he urged his constituents to make their views known. And local councillors of all parties in Aberdeenshire opposed the closure proposal. Of course.
Dave Thompson.
I thank the member for taking an intervention, and he is quite correct in his quote in relation to myself. But Mr MacDonald will obviously realise that there are real difficulties in terms of the Scottish Government's budget. So if he wants no changes whatsoever, and no savings whatsoever in the court services, what other areas is he suggesting that the Justice Secretary should cut?
Thompson was listening when I pointed out that this Justice Secretary wilfully allowed £24 million of police service funding to be liable for payment to the UK Government in VAT. But even if that was not the case, the idea that you take justice away from 17 different courts across Scotland to save £1 million a year, I don't think it takes a genius to work out that that is a false priority on the part of the Scottish Government. And indeed, Angus Council, led by the SNP, Mike Weir, the SNP Member of Parliament in Angus, they have argued that both Arbroath and Forfar should stay open. I'm sure I'll be very interested to hear if Graham Day backs up that view and will argue and vote to keep Arbroath Sheriff Court in being. But this is not the first time in recent months that Mr McCaskill has proposed changes which many in his own party could not support. After proposing to abolish prison visiting committees, he had to revisit the issue not once but several times, and he may yet come up with a plan for that policy area that commands broad support. But now he needs to bite the bullet and take a different approach on courts. He will bring statutory instruments forward to the Justice Committee in the summer to give effect to his closure proposals. It would be best if he agreed to reconsider the whole matter before doing so. But if he will not do that, the Cabinet Secretary could, if he wished, bring forward a number of separate orders for the several different closure proposals which have different degrees of merit or demerit to allow the committee to express a view on each of them. If he declines that suggestion, I hope members across the chamber will reject the government amendment in order to send a clear signal that ministers should enable proper decisions to be taken on each closure proposal rather than putting them all on a take it or leave it basis. That way, communities can see for themselves which members are prepared to vote to keep open their local court and which will meekly vote in favour of Kenny McCaskill's cuts and closures. I call on members of all parties to rise to that challenge, and I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. Before I call the Cabinet Secretary, I just make the point that some key participants were not here for the start of this debate, and it's particularly important that members who wish to speak in the debate are here for the beginning of the debate, because if they're not, they're in danger of not being called. However, it is absolutely vital that closing speakers are here for the start of the debate, and I would just wish to remind members to make sure that they note that business is fluid, and if an item finishes a bit early, then we will proceed to the next item of business. Cabinet Secretary, you have 10 minutes to move Amendment S4M 06306.2.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to respond to Lewis MacDonald in this Labour motion this afternoon. Firstly, let us be clear about responsibilities. The Scottish Court Service is an independent body under the leadership of the Lord President. It is the Scottish Court Service which consulted on a range of proposals to use their estate more efficiently. Some of the proposals are operational matters for the Lord President, including those relating to sheriff and jury centres and the location of the High Court. However, proposals to close courts need the approval of ministers and require to come before Parliament, which takes me on to consultation. As the Parliament is aware, I announced last Thursday that I was accepting the recommendations set out in the Scottish Court Service's response to their consultation. There has been nothing secret about this process. The then Lord President confirmed to the Justice Committee in November 2011 that consideration was being given to the issue of future court structures. The Court Service wrote to inform stakeholders about this work in September and again in December 2011. There was further stakeholder engagement before a full consultation was launched in September 2012 by the Court Service. This ended in December and was independently analysed before the Court Service provided their final proposals on the 9th of April. I am aware that many members will want to make the case for the courts in their own constituencies. I would expect no less. and it is understandable that they should wish to express their concerns. I appreciate that. However, it's worth noting the context in which options for future court structures are being looked at. By all means.
Lewis MacDonald.
I hear what he says, that these proposals are not his, and that he made a decision on the proposals between Tuesday and, he says, Thursday of last week. Given his commitment last Tuesday to consult with Cabinet colleagues, can he tell us what consultation he had between Tuesday and Thursday of last week on the impact of implementing those proposals?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, no, I answered a topical question, matters that are meant to be dealt with because matters of urgence, as a question from John Lamont, who was looking for my position. I indicated in that I would be making it clear shortly, and shortly I did. I took the proportionate, responsible time, and I dealt with matters to balance the need and the desire of Mr Lamont, who wanted, indeed, probably, I think, was seeking me to make a decision there and then on the Tuesday, but that would have been inappropriate, and that is why, as I say, matters were dealt with later in the week. We are embarking on the most significant changes to the legal system in well over a century, following the recommendations from the reviews conducted by Lord Gill, the current Lord President, Lord Carloway, Sheriff Principal Bowen and the current Victims and Witnesses Bill. We also face unprecedented cuts in the funding that the Scottish Government receives from Westminster. By all means.
Jenny Mara.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Given that some of these reforms will actually mean an increase in business for Sheriff Court, such as PI cases coming down from the Court of Session to the Sheriff Court, would it not be wise to wait until after these reforms have bedded in to then make an assessment of court capacity and court closures?
Cabinet Secretary.
No, I don't believe so. I think these matters have been factored in quite appropriately by the Scottish Court Service, and if Ms Mara has concerns, then I suggest she should raise that with the Lord President and indeed with Eric McQueen, the Chief Executive. As set out by the First Minister in his programme for government, in real terms, the capital budget of the Scottish Government today is 30% lower than it was in 2009. In addition, at the recent Labour Party conference, Mr MacDonald accused of us not putting our money where our mouth is in terms of helping witnesses. He listed a number of additional things he would like to see, including an independent commissioner and case companions. He also told Victim Support Scotland last year that it's clear that too often victims and witnesses find themselves in the same room as an accused. That just shouldn't happen. What they do not say is all of this needs to be funded from the same declining budgets. Against this backdrop, everyone within the justice system is looking at ways to deliver a justice system that is fair and accessible, cost-effective and efficient, and whilst these reforms will save money, it is not the only driver for change. Other factors include closing underutilised courts that can sit unused for long periods of time, closing courts that are no longer fit for purpose. Indeed, many of these reasons are similar to those used by the UK Government when they announced in 2010 the closure of 93 magistrates' courts and 49 county courts across England and Wales. Looking at proposals for changes to court structures, we need to think not only about geography, but also about what we demand from our justice system in the 21st century. By all means.
Thank you. I think there are significant differences in the geographic conditions between the closure south of the border and here in terms of distance having to be travelled. We'll come to that later. But the Cabinet Secretary mentioned the importance of the consultation at great length. What sort of court service, or indeed what sort of government is it, that seems to be happy to reject the findings of 95% of respondents to any consultation?
Well, I don't think the residents of Alnwick, Penrith and Whitehaven might take the same view as Mr Ferguson regarding geography and their central location. So these are challenges that are faced, but I am acting upon the best advice given to me by our most senior judge and those who are charged with looking after the interests of the Scottish Court Service, to deal with the challenges and demands that Labour make, that we can't make any cuts to legal aid, that we can't make any cuts to courts. The only thing we can cut is 1,000 extra police officers that this government's delivered, and that we will not do. That's why the Scottish Government set up the Making Justice Work programme. It brings together all the key agencies and provides a strategic, joined-up approach to reform, focusing on creating an efficient and effective justice system which is fair and accessible and improves the experiences of users. In terms of the courts, Sheriff Principal Bowen's review of Sheriff and Jury and Lord Gill's review of the civil courts sets out the basis for a fundamental change in the way business is conducted. They emphasise greater specialisation and a move away from a model where all types of business is conducted at all court locations. And in thinking about the future business of the courts, we must also recognise that recorded crime is at its lowest level since 1975 and is down by 25% since 2006-07. Indeed, the number of people convicted in our courts continues to fall and is down 19% from its peak in 2006-07. The situation is similar in terms of our civil courts, where the number of cases last year was 13% lower than the year before. So we can all see that the towns that we live in, the places we work, the way we do business, the availability of transport have changed radically since Victorian times. The future I see in Scotland is one where justice is not only based in the physical building of a court, but where justice is delivered in a range of ways best suited to users of the system, whether victims, witnesses or those raising a civil action. Together we need to think in new and innovative ways about the needs of justice in a 21st century Scotland, to take advantage of opportunities provided by new technology, whether video links for conducting court proceedings, raising a civil action online, or paying fines by telephone rather than travelling. All of these are features of work underway. There have been concerns raised about victims and witnesses finding it harder to travel if court locations are closed. The Court Service measured these proposals against the judicial principles for provision of access to justice, which were developed in discussion with the Lord President, Lord Justice Clerk and the Sheriff Principals. Specifically, the Court Service looked to ensure that most people will be able to travel to their local court by public transport so as to arrive at the start of the case in which they are concerned and be able to return home in public transport on the same day. These concerns are not taken lightly, but they have to be balanced against the number of people affected. The court's proposed foreclosure account for only 5% of the total court business, and in the majority of cases will be transferred to another court within 20 miles. In addition, it's worth noting that for some in small towns or rural areas, there may be better travel links to the major centres than to other small towns. I appreciate that there may be some concerns about the effect on local communities. I realise that a court can be regarded as an important element of the community. However, this needs balanced against the fact that many similar and larger communities function without a local court. Some of our older court buildings require extensive modernisation and repair to bring them up to standards which victims, witnesses and jurors expect. In some cases, for example, there is simply not enough room to segregate victims and witnesses. These proposals will allow the Court Service to focus future investment across a smaller group of buildings to ensure that they continue to deliver a quality service. And through making the Justice Work programme, we are also taking action to ensure that victims and witnesses are called to court when necessary and to increase the number of trials which go ahead. To conclude, we cannot deliver better access to justice by avoiding the need for change. It is right that we examine structures that have served us since the 19th century to consider if they best deliver the expectations of the public in the 21st century. In his foreword to the Court Service response to the consultation, Lord Gill stated, "I am confident that the proposals in the report will contribute significantly to the success of the forthcoming justice reforms." I move the motion amendment in my name.
Many thanks. Now call on Margaret Mitchell to speak to and move Amendment S4M 06306.1. Mrs Mitchell, 6 minutes, please.
Right. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I congratulate the Labour Party in bringing this debate to the Chamber today, following the Scottish Government's decision to cut the Scottish Court Service operating budget by 20% in real terms by 2015 and to slash its capital budget from 20 million to 4 million. The Scottish Conservatives will be supporting the motion this evening and voting against the amendment in the Cabinet Secretary's name, for despite the fact that the Scottish Government budget from the UK Government for 2012-13 has seen a cash terms increase of £250 million, no effort has been made to protect, let alone increase, the Scottish Court Service budget. This is by any standards an act of extreme folly and has resulted in the Scottish Court Service having to recommend the closure of a fifth of Scotland's Sheriff Courts, along with 9 related JP courts and an additional 4 standalone GP courts, as well as the reduction in the High Court circuit, all within a very short timescale. It is therefore the Scottish Government's decision to agree such drastic closures, which the Scottish Conservative and other parties seek to reverse in order to allow a rethink to avoid the far-reaching and adverse consequences which will inevitably follow if these closures go ahead. Sheriff Courts, very briefly, I'm short of time.
I just wonder if the member then has an alternative as to where the money should come from. Should it come from the health budget?
There's a cash term increase. It's the Scottish Government to make priorities, but these closures are not going to make just savings. They're going to be additional costs, not factored in at all. Sheriff Courts have increasingly come under pressure in recent years due to more criminal business being passed down from the High Court as a result of the Bonamy reforms, a situation made worse by the Scottish Government proposal to transfer more civil business to the Sheriff Courts when the Crown Office budget is being cut in real terms, resulting in less resources for fiscal and legal staff. The Cabinet Secretary states the closure will only affect 5% of cases. To put this in context, according to the SCS's own consultation figures, this will require an excess of 12,500 cases or GP complaints to be heard elsewhere. More worryingly still, this figure does not include the complaints heard by the 9 GP courts, which will close as they share premises with Sheriff Courts, also set for closure. Yet, as already stated, the Scottish Government is at the same time proposing to transfer civil business from the Court of Session to Sheriff Courts. While the Cabinet Secretary has repeatedly claimed that this proposal has been taken into account by the Scottish Court Service, it is difficult to see how that can be the case when the SCS consultation closed 2 months before the Government court reforms plans were published. The Justice Secretary says the Victims and Witness Bill seeks to put victims first, victim interests first, at the heart of the improvements to the justice system, and to help make what is often the most difficult episode in someone's life a bit easier. But in reality, the attempt to make savings by closing these courts and diverting criminal and civil business to already overstretched courts comes at the expense of victims and witnesses who will have to deal with access to justice issues. And interestingly, I note that SCS recommendations have not been subject to a formal equality impact assessment. For let's be in absolutely no doubt that court users will face increased travel time and distances. For example, the closure of Kirkcudbright will mean a 45-minute, 28-mile journey to Dumfries, adding to costs and making delays and disruption to court business more likely. Worse still, any potential closure savings will be lost in increased spending on legal aid, police cover and cover for professionals attending court as witnesses. Furthermore, as the Federation of Small Businesses and the Law Society, amongst others, point out in their response to the SCS consultation, that courts have a positive economic impact on local areas. So whilst I welcome the decision to grant a stay of execution to Alloa Sheriff Court and Coatbridge GP Court in my constituency, the decision to close GP courts in Motherwell and Cumbernauld will be a bitter blow for struggling town centre business there. The closure of courts will also see the descaling of local solicitors and the loss of continuity provided by sheriffs and JPs with knowledge of local communities. These concerns cannot be dismissed, as the Cabinet Secretary has attempted to do this afternoon, by the assertion that technology can fill the gap. Video conferences and a webcam is no substitute for courts, which maintain visibility of justice for communities. And this was a view confirmed only this week at the Justice Committee, when witnesses from the Faculty of Advocates and the Law Society of Scotland stated that, notwithstanding some some limited exceptions for vulnerable witnesses, the default position should always be that it's better for witnesses to be in court, especially given the importance in some cases of the body language and even physical appearance of witnesses, which is difficult to assess via TV link. They also stressed that TV links make it difficult to build up a rapport with witnesses and that technical issues are common. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I suggest the outrage would be such that the Scottish Government would shy away from agreeing the closure of a fifth of our schools or the closure of a fifth of our hospitals. So why are our courts, with all the adverse consequences for access to justice and the Scottish justice system, considered fair game? Quite simply, an urgent rethink is needed by the Scottish Government to protect our local courts, and I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. We now move to the open debate, and I call on Sandra White to be followed by Ian Gray. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I would like to take this moment to acknowledge the contributions from Lewis MacDonald and Margaret Mitchell. I think I certainly take on board the concerns they've raised, and as a member of the Justice Committee, we would like to take this opportunity to assure them that the committee will scrutinise the recommendations robustly and thoroughly. In the process of our scrutiny, I am sure we will explore in detail the specific concerns the members have raised and would welcome their input in this process, and I am sure we will certainly get and receive their input. Now, whilst Lewis MacDonald may regret the speed at which the recommendations have been taken forward, and it's mentioned in the Labour motion, I do believe he agrees that there is a need for reform. I think he is also aware, as many as here are, of the UK Coalition's Government's cuts agenda, which is of course affecting the money given to Scotland by the UK Government. And as the Cabinet Secretary has already pointed out, there has been a 26% real terms cut by the Westminster Government to Scotland's capital budget. Now, against this background, I think every one of us must admit it is inevitable that difficult decisions will, in fact, need to be taken. Now, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Court Services... Yes?
Malik.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering how you square that members from your own party are opposed to some of the cuts, and they make it very clear. Yet when it comes to decision time, they shy away from that. So what do the people of Scotland to believe, that this is a party that we've not to trust anymore?
Mr Malik, I think when you look at the results of the elections, I think it certainly seems that people of Scotland trust the Scottish National Party rather than the Labour Party. So I think you don't need any lessons from Hansel and Malik. Now, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Court Services have stated that the impact of the closures will affect 5% of the overall court business. They also point out that currently the 3 High Court centres currently hear around 80% of all cases. Indeed, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Court Services has also said that they are confident that more than enough capacity exists to deal with current and future volumes of business. And I'm sure the Justice Committee will explore this in more detail when we take evidence on this particular issue. But if I could just take up Margaret Mitchell's points on overstretched courts, and I'd like to put forward some facts. When you look at the numbers here, the number of summary complaints registered at Sheriff Courts have declined from over 8,000 per month to under 6,000 per month. Together, the number of summary complaints registered at the Sheriff and GP courts has shown a continual and consistent decline. And the number of High Court indictments registered had declined from just under 90 per month to just over 60 per month. Now, I think if Margaret Mitchell would admit that there is perhaps room for manoeuvre and perhaps, when we see the evidence, for improvement. Now, one area that was identified in the recommendation was the use of information technology to make the whole experience more effective. And I think we all know of the huge advances we've made in recent years and the opportunity these advances present. Now, a few years ago, I think not just I, but others here would never have imagined that we'd be able to talk to someone directly to, and the one I'm thinking of is say, Malawi. We wouldn't be able to speak to someone in Malawi, and in certain circumstances, as the convener of cross-party group in Palestine, I've actually had video links with people in the West Bank being able to ask some questions, and they would answer in return. Now, I think every one of us would admit that this is something we can develop, this type of technology, in the court services. Of course, I understand we need to ensure that it's only perhaps in specific areas of the court service that it can be used, but it's certainly something we should be looking into, which would benefit absolutely everyone, I think. Now, in the responses to the initial consultation,
there was a very positive response to the increase in the use of technology, particularly in relation to the administrative side of things and the registration of cases. There was also a positive response to the idea of allowing certain, as I said before, court appearances to be done by live video link. In fact, as part of the Scottish Government's Making Justice work programme in the north of Scotland, work is nearing completion to result in the introduction of a new secure live link video conferencing network that will include 6 northern courts and 4 other local locations. Now, this will give criminal justice organisations, which is very important, I think, in the justice system, the opportunity to use the technology for some cases instead of participants having to travel to court. And I think you would all agree, these are positive possibilities and the ones that we should embrace. And as I said before, I think we all recognise the need for reform, and we'll all certainly recognise that the UK Government is making huge cuts to Scotland, and we all have a responsibility to spell out how we are going to deal with them. Now, with that in mind, I must admit to being slightly confused with the Labour Party's motion. It appears they recognise the need for reform and highlights their opposition to the closure of some courts, but does that mean they recognise the need to close the ones they don't mention? To me, it seems a wee bit odd, I must admit, and perhaps the member would like to take the opportunity to clarify this position, or perhaps not. Certainly, I can't thank the member for his clarification, but certainly, if he doesn't want to intervene, he can perhaps, in the closing speech, raise that particular one. Indeed, his colleague Jenny Marr, in a recent interview, also failed.
Members in the last minute. Thank you,
President. Indeed, his colleague Jenny Marr, in a recent interview, also failed to provide clarity on the Labour Party's proposals. Jenny Marr acknowledged that there were inefficiencies, going on to state that the Labour Party wasn't opposed to all cuts across the board, saying Joanne Lamont has already said that she would be prepared to put this on the table. Well, I don't know what Joanne Lamont's opinion is on these matters. In fact, I don't really know what her opinion is in many matters, and I don't think the Scottish people know that also. But as in conclusion, Presiding Officer, in closing, the Scottish Government is clearly stating its position on the future of court services, and it really would be good if the opposition parties could state their absolute position also. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Many thanks. Now move to Ian Gray, to be followed by James Dornan. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Over a year ago, I said that there was a hit list of court closures being prepared and that my local court in Haddington was on it. The Cabinet Secretary said then that I was scaremongering and that there were no such plans. Sure enough, the hit list was published, and he then said no closures without local consultation. So we marshalled over 150 substantive submissions and evidence and thousands of signatures in opposition to closing Haddington's courts. There were no submissions in favour of closure. What kind of local consultation weighs in the balance all the evidence against no evidence and comes down on the side of no evidence at all? A sham, a deception and a disgrace. I was not scaremongering, and the Cabinet Secretary was dissembling. And last week, he consigned my local court to the dustbin of history. And history matters. Haddington has had courts of some kind for centuries. We've had lay justice there since the time of James VI. Local justice survived the Siege of Haddington, Cromwell, the Reformation, the Treaty of the Union, 2 world wars and Margaret Thatcher. But it seems it will not survive Kenny McCaskill. Haddington Court is busy, contrary to the impression the Cabinet Secretary tried to create last week. It dealt with more civil cases than any of the other courts slated to close. Over 3,000 criminal cases were prosecuted last year. Many community sentences and drug treatment orders were monitored. Adults with incapacity applications alone soared by 70%. And with the fastest growing population in Scotland, East Lothian court work can only increase. Victims and witnesses will face considerable inconvenience travelling to Edinburgh. Those seeking civil redress or involved in family actions face not only their own travel costs, but up to £400 more to cover additional travelling time for their agents for each court appearance. And family actions, as Mr McCaskill will well know, can involve as many as 12 such hearings. He might save small change in his budget, but my constituents will pay dearly. Local lawyers indeed say that legal aid work for them may become financially unviable, undermining access to advice and costing local jobs. Haddington Citizens Advice also believe that their representation of clients will be compromised. And ironically, Mr McCaskill chose this very cab to launch the first Lawworks legal advice service in Scotland and praised their in-court advisers, some of whom are here today, but here today because they fear their jobs will be gone tomorrow if he persists in closing this court. As for Justices of the Peace, all but a handful of East Lothian JPs have made it clear that they would not be willing to serve in Edinburgh, with a knock-on effect for non-bench work such as signing warrants for police officers. Mind you, those police officers may not need any warrants because they will be spending all their time travelling to and from Edinburgh or sitting around Edinburgh Sheriff Court instead of doing police work in East Lothian. That is what our share of those extra police officers will be spending their time doing. And all this to save £81,000 per annum, a figure disputed by forensic accountancy evidence submitted to the consultation, and most of which will anyway be pushed onto other public sector budgets. Now, the greatest harm in these proposals is the compromising of local access to justice and the abrogation of the principle that justice must be seen to be done, not dispensed at a distance. But there is another kind of damage too. Haddington is a county town with a proud history and a community working hard to maintain its vibrancy. Only last week, the town market was successfully re-established. A trust has just been elected to regenerate the town. The county archives have come home to a magnificent new library. An employability hub has opened to boost local opportunity. This Saturday, our local radio station takes to the airwaves. And now, the dead hand of the Cabinet Secretary reaches out into the heart of Haddington to snuff the life out of one of our key institutions. Not standing up for Scotland, but stamping down on one of Scotland's oldest towns. And in this context, he so often falls back on the example of his own hometown of Linlithgow. What he omits to say, of course, is that justice was not removed from West Lothian as a county. The administrative centre of West Lothian moved to Livingston and the court went with it. There is no suggestion of the provision of a court somewhere else in my county of East Lothian. Jobs will go, local shops and businesses will suffer, and civic pride will be hurt. And I have to say that the Cabinet Secretary's amendment is as dishonest as his consultation. First, it pretends that this decision is somehow forced on him by someone else. A ridiculous assertion, given the saving of £80,000. And then he tries to present it as a modernisation of the court service. False and false again. This is the Cabinet Secretary's decision, taken solely to balance his books, without regard for principle, wider impact, or indeed the evidence. It is the casual, unwitting vandalism of the bean-counting bureaucrat, and it is unworthy of a minister entrusted with the stewardship of Scottish justice, and it is unbecoming of a Scottish Cabinet charged with the well-being of Scotland's towns and communities like Haddington.
You must close, please.
I simply ask him to pause, consider and think again.
Thank you very much. Now call on James Dornan to be followed by Richard Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I don't think anyone will disagree that Scotland needs a court system fit for the 21st century, one which takes account of the changing nature of crime and the technological advances of the last decade. The plans outlined in the Scottish Court Service papers shaping Scotland's court services appears at the outset, and by their own admission, stark, but they are, as the report suggests, proportionate and much needed, and will help us move towards modifying our court systems for the better. Crime in Scotland is changing because of commitments in crime prevention that this Scottish Government have made and met. Overall crime levels are at a 37-year low. This fall in crime has seen the number of summary cases in sheriff courts, as my colleague Sandra White said, courts across Scotland fall from £8,000 per month in 2008 to just under £6,000 per month in 2012. This fall in crime is coupled with a change in the types of crimes being committed. We make improvements to tackle these new crimes, such as cyberbullying, but to do that we need to utilise all our justice resources more efficiently. resources, as has already been mentioned, that are under ever-increasing strain. The Scottish Government's capital budget has been cut in real terms by 26% by the Westminster Government. The Scottish Courts Service has estimated it can make a saving of £1 million a year in running costs and £3 million in maintenance costs. Yes.
I'm grateful to Mr Jones. Given what he has just said, which reflects the Government's amendment, which states a belief that the proposals will support a future court service that is fit for the 21st century, can he tell me why any of us should accept any of the arguments that his party are putting forward about budgetary constraints as anything other than a complete red herring designed to divert attention away from the real impact of these proposals?
In my view, it's the budgetary restraints that have probably brought us here at this time, but it certainly is a modernisation of the justice service system that will come out at the end of it. Whilst these proposals will save money, if implemented, they will also modify our court system to reflect the changing nature of crime and, as importantly, the tools that we now have to make the court system even better. We do need courts that are fit for the 21st century, not wedded to the needs of a justice system conceived in Victorian times. The main bone of contention in the motion appears to be around the proposals to close some sheriff and justice of peace courts across the country. The report discusses these proposals at length and mentions that the main opposition to this was the added travel that could be placed on the small number of court users that these closures would affect. There was also a worry that this would be coupled with a general loss of locality in dealing with crime. This is an extremely important area and deserves serious consideration, and that is what the SCS report has done. In making its proposals over which courthouses to close, it looked at a number of factors, including what percentage of witnesses, based on the evidence of the last year, would have had a longer or shorter journey to the courts. In the example of Stonehaven, mentioned in the motion, 44.1% of witnesses would have had a shorter journey compared with the 31.9% who have had a journey increase of more than 10 miles. In Haddington, 37.8% of witnesses would have had a shorter journey compared to 22.3% who would have had a journey increase of over 10 miles. We also need to face the stark reality that with a decreasing budget, it will not be possible to keep local delivery in all cases, particularly where the demand for the cases is so low. The work undertaken in the courts that are mooted for closure is about 5% of overall court business, and the SCS says it could be easily subsumed in the work of the other courts. And as the SCS themselves have noted, it makes little sense for the professional body dealing with Scotland's courts to propose changes that would adversely impact upon the people that they represent. And I think we should take them at their word, rather than accusing the SCS, as some have done, of doing the bidding of the Cabinet Secretary. I also think that it is important to mention that the closures of the courts come under a backdrop of more technological and innovative ways that the courts are working. The SCS wants to see a time where most of our work carried out by the service is conducted online, over the telephone or over video, where witnesses would not be required physically in court, but would be able to present their evidence in the local police station. We have the technology to make this happen, and pilot studies are being conducted on this across Scotland. The SCS envisages a time in the near future where the distance to your local court is almost moot, because a lot of the work would be conducted even more locally. I appreciate that we're nowhere near that at this stage. The continuance of the move to the sheriff-centred model is contingent upon development of increased use of video and other communications technology in court proceeding. These proposals streamline the court system, make it more efficient, will use technology that will change the way that witnesses and victims attend at court, and will save money in these times of increasing austerity. And while we're on the subject of money, where can the money come from to maintain these underutilised courts? Since the draft 2013-14 budget was announced, Labour have called for almost £3.4 billion to be found to resource a number of spending calls, including £1 billion to re-regulate the bus companies, not undertaken in the 8 years that Labour were in power, £500,000 to extend the concessionary travel scheme in Edinburgh to cover the trams. This is the concessionary travel scheme that the Labour Party seem to wish to scrap. And the £5.1 million called for by Jenny Mara in a press release on 9th of April regarding the closure of the sheriff courts. In fact, when questioned on the proposals and what exactly she would forego to pay for keeping the courts open, she replied, "Look, I'm not John Swinney. I don't have the budget in front of me." Perhaps at last, recognition that trying to fund everything and never a decreasing pot of money handed down from Westminster does require that some difficult decisions need to be made. Presiding Officer, nobody likes to see local services being closed. There's no doubt at all that there's difficult decisions being made here. I completely understand why local members are up defending eloquently, as Mr Gray did just there, but there are difficult decisions that have to be made. We are under very tight financial constraints, and I think that the Justice Secretary is going the right way about dealing with this, and I ask you to support the amendment.
Thanks so much. Now Colin Richard-Simpson, to be followed by Colin Keir.
Presiding Officer, I welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate today, as two of the courts in the consultation fall within my own region of Mid-Scotland and Fife. One of the courts, Alloa, has been saved, but temporarily, pending room being created at Falkirk and Stirling to allow it to be closed, and therefore effectively it will be closed in due course once the Cabinet Secretary is ready. Cooper, on the other hand, is now facing the axe almost immediately. These are ill-thought-out plans to close the Cooper Court, which would first and foremost affect the ability to have justice seen to be done locally. But the closure would go much further, including its effect upon the local economy, which has not been taken into account, the potential loss to local businesses, those directly and indirectly connected to the court system, which will inevitably lead to the loss of local jobs. Furthermore, the court's relocation will lead to a hit on local business footfall. And in particular, the local law firms have told me that they may be forced to relocate their business to a location nearer Dundee in order to keep staff costs down. That, of course, if they are financially able to make such a move. In saying that this analysis that has been carried out has been ill thought out, the court service have only actually looked at the matters affecting the court service. It is the Cabinet Secretary's responsibility to look at the more global effects, the potential effects upon the legal businesses, the potential effects upon the local economy, the potential losses of jobs, and the potential costs in terms of the continued uptake of a building which may well not be sold, as there are other buildings there sold. What's the unoccupied rates going to be? None of these issues have been taken into account. It is his responsibility to have taken the broader issue into account, and he has singularly failed to consult his Cabinet colleagues over the past few days in making this very rapid decision. Then there's the question of the costs to Fife Council, who will continue to be asked to provide social workers, community payback officers to attend cases, but they will now be expected to travel outside their region to Dundee in order to give evidence advice. And this will not only lead to an increase in the travel costs, but an increase in staff costs. This could damage vital services if these areas are left understaffed because they have to spend much more time travelling to and from the court than they have done previously. So what assessment has the Minister made of the effect upon Fife Council? Any? There's nothing in the documents to suggest this. Now, I'm pleased that Alloa Court will not be closing after an active campaign with my colleague Gordon Banks and other stakeholders have been engaged in, and even Keith Brown, the Minister, has participated in this, though I note he's not in the chamber today to observe the debate. The fact is that the closure of Alloa Court will only occur once there's additional space at Stirling and Falkirk. This, of course, will require capital expenditure, which, in view of the cuts I expect in forward planning, will not be occurring over the next period of time. But who knows? And in the meantime, the planning of the local businesses, the law businesses in Alloa, will be predicated upon its eventual closure, which means loss of services to my constituents. What is abundantly clear is a lack of understanding or acceptance of the value of local courts. The Scottish Court Service was tasked to look at the future of the Scottish courts, subjecting them to substantial cuts. This is justice on the cheap. Interestingly, when Labour tried to rationalise NHS hospitals on the grounds of patient safety and acting on the best advice of the medical practitioners, what did the SNP do? They recognised an opportunity and supported localism and no closures. They also made a manifesto pledge that they would close no beds, a pledge which they singularly broke by having closed 1,500 beds, almost 10% of all the hospital beds. So they were in favour of localism, but they've closed the beds. They are now not in favour of local justice, which seems to me to be a strange position for this party to face two ways. However, the Janus-like effect of the SNP is becoming more evident by the day. The travelling is one of the most important things. I have had experience as a witness in appearing on courts on many occasions, appearing in many family cases and issues of freeing of adoption and child protection issues, where my whole team has had to appear and has been engaged sometimes for days on end in these cases. And frankly, my patients would have suffered without a local court with my whole team having to appear, and cases also still being repeatedly postponed. Now, I know we've made things more efficient over the last 10 years, but nevertheless this is still likely to occur. The effect upon staff of all sorts would be significant. And certainly I remember when I was Justice Minister, one of the main issues that was brought to me was the fact of police time in courts being extensive. If they have to travel significant distances now and spend times, this will significantly undermine the extra police that have been put into the communities, something of which the SNP are inordinately proud. None of us are opposed to modernisation. Indeed, as Justice Minister, I was involved in bringing in pilots on video conferencing for pleading diets, outsourcing escorts, setting up 2 reviews of court procedures. But there is a principle at stake here. Courts like Cooper and Alloa are at the heart of their communities. This, presiding officer, was a poor consultation with a poor analysis that failed to take into account the wider aspects involved, failed to take into account the views of the communities which were almost universally against these closures. The Cabinet Secretary should be sent home to think again.
Thank you very much. Now call on Colin Keir to be followed by Rod Campbell.
Officer, closure of any local amenity usually brings some objections. Some objections are based on available factual data and other objections on emotional ties. But there are key questions that have to be asked. For instance, is the service provided fit for purpose? How accessible is the service? Not just in terms of the cost of those using or working in it, but in terms of the buildings being used. Does the service meet the modern requirements for 21st century business? Indeed, how often is it open for business? Is the service model being used affordable? Is it sustainable? We've heard others in this debate say that we are facing perhaps the toughest economic challenge in many, many generations, with devastating cuts to the Scottish Grant from Westminster. This is undeniable. These cuts were forecast by Alistair Darling, are being implemented with venom by the Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition. Let me carry on, please, Mr Gray, maybe later. While the Scottish Government is left to juggle a shrinking fixed income in order to support vital public services, of which the Scottish Court Service is but one. So is the Scottish Court Service affordable using its present business model? I believe the answer is no. Is the service sustainable in its present form, given the financial cuts from Westminster? Most certainly not. So what are the options? Well, if there is no reform, the entire legal system, let alone court service, could collapse. Amongst other things, you will have to be extremely wealthy to afford to enter a legal dispute. Legal aid could, of course.
I do understand that this line about cuts in the Scottish budget has been handed out from somewhere centrally in the SNP. But really, I have to say to Mr Keir, the saving at my court will be £80,000 a year. The cost of travel for non-legal people using the courts in a year will be £85,000. The burden of cost has been shifted directly onto my constituents, and it's making justice impossible for them to afford. Exactly the opposite of the point he's making.
Well, absolutely not. I'd probably say quite a lot of the business at Haddington possibly comes from Musselburgh, Trinent and other places. Some places have an easier journey into Edinburgh than others. But I would say, if we have a situation here that money is so easy to get, why is it that your party leader down south, in fact every party leader down south, is calling this an age of austerity? That usually means there's some problem with finance getting through to public services, something which we're trying to help here. So, in the interest of sustainability, the entire justice portfolio has to look at sustainable change for any reforms to work. There's no point in just salami slicing the budgets of each department or body if we want to keep a world-renowned legal service intact and available to all. These closures have been identified by the Scottish Court Service, and the Scottish Court Service believes proposed changes will work, given the financial constraints they face. Opponents cite problems with overloading of work in courts, which remain. The SCS Chief Executive, Eric McQueen, doesn't believe it's in the best interest of SCS to allow this to happen and doesn't believe it will happen under these proposals. There will be, I'm sure, some people who may have to make a longer journey at some point under the new proposals, but again, Eric McQueen believes the numbers to be small. Unreasonable travelling demands for those involved in court proceedings should be, in most cases, avoided. I do believe in this day and age also that video conferencing, as has been mentioned by Sandra White and others, is an option that can be made available, as Sandra said, in certain instances. I'm also aware that yesterday's Justice Committee evidence session, a panellist gave an opinion that video conferencing has its limitations as you cannot get a clear vision, so to speak, of the witness or defendant's true demeanour. While I partially agree with this comment, modern HD TV on a modern link would be able to pick up facial expressions, for example, the sort of things you look for when trying to work out if someone is trying to hide something from you. Video conferencing has come a long way in a short time, and if the Scottish Court Service is to keep a lid on costs, then new technology must be used. After all, the service can't stay looking like a bit part player in a Dickens novel. Given the age of the Scottish Court Service estate, there's also the possibility of business being moved to a modern court building or a law centre, one in which those who are charged with offences and those who are victims are not able to meet each other by accident prior to proceedings beginning. While I understand this problem cannot be guaranteed to end other than in highly designed modern courts or law centres, we do have older buildings which accused and victims have been known to sit outside the courtroom in the same corridor, which is not a pleasant experience. An example of this, in fact, was given to the Justice Committee just a few weeks ago in a closed meeting with some victims of crime. Of course, it is regrettable that the SCS wants to close some of these court buildings. Many are seen as historical pieces of the fabric of a town. But if the SCS is to change its mind on any of these proposals, there has to be more to the argument for saving than just history, and I'm sure that the members involved here have been looking into this. For politicians in this chamber looking more strategically and opposing these proposals, I'd say, let's see the colour of your money. It's as simple as that. What do you want to cut to pay for the status quo, and how do you make the service sustainable and available to all? It's time for Labour to come clean, and perhaps the best saving we could make is by losing the Westminster Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I call on Rod Campbell to be followed by Alison McInnes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. May I refer to my register of interest as a member of the Faculty of Advocates? When times are tough, operating within the confines of a declining budget, as the Scottish Government does, with the capital budget being reduced by 26%, is challenging. In an ideal world, we might hope to follow the model of modern courts with superb facilities for witnesses, jurors and the like. And I am pleased that reference is made in the SCS response to purpose-built justice centres, including one for Fife, an absolutely admirable aspiration, but not one that is on the current horizon, I'm afraid to say, for Fife. So instead, we're endeavouring to create a new structure of courts, civil and criminal, where cases are dealt with at an appropriate level. It's against that backdrop that the SCS launched its consultation. In relation to sheriff and jury cases being dealt with in fewer centres, I have to say I don't disagree. But for significant parts of rural Scotland, these proposals are going to involve witnesses in particular in greater expense in time and travelling to court. Whilst this review has provided examples of travelling distances and times and indicated how comparatively few individual witnesses may be affected, for the individuals concerned, that may be no consolation. For Fife, indeed, these proposals are severe. The removal of sheriff and jury work from Kirkcaldy to Dunfermline in the west means that court will receive more business than ever. And while I understand the loss felt in Kirkcaldy, at least they retain a court, unlike my own constituents. Whilst I accept the case for removing the small number of sheriff and jury cases from Cooper, it's the removal of the day-to-day civil and criminal work which is difficult to accept, and which I believe will have an economic impact. For those in Forfar, while losing solemn business to Dundee, they retain summary business. This will be over a period of time, maybe 10 years before they lose all the solemn business. For Cooper, the impact will be immediate. Having regard to the structure of our court systems, I agree with Lord Gill's proposal for a three-tier system, as he laid out in his report on the Scottish Civil Courts Review, as an effective solution in modernising our court structures. The creation of new summary sheriffs to hear summary criminal cases, family cases and lower value civil business in the Sheriff Courts is to be welcomed. However, the September consultation on court structures implied from a table attached to it that summary sheriffs for Cooper would be based in Dundee. However, we know that the Scottish Government's own Making Justice Work consultation on court reform, which focuses on areas such as the role of summary sheriffs, is of course still open. I take the view that the creation of summary sheriffs as proposed by Lord Gill would be a great deal step forward to make court business more efficient. But I see no good reason, for example, why consideration of the role of a peripatetic summary sheriff should not be taken further. Indeed, the September consultation document, paragraph 2.12, refers to visiting members of the judiciary and the sharing of accommodation with other public services. I don't see very much about that in the response itself. And while I agree with the proposal that summary sheriffs should have some concurrent jurisdiction with sheriffs, they will be constrained if there are no buildings, for example, to hear and dispense justice in my part of the world other than in Dundee. Presiding Officer, one of the arguments, though not the principal argument for closing Cooper, was that the court service would make significant savings on the backlog for essential maintenance work. In Cooper's case, some £470,000. We know, as Eric McQueen, Chief Executive for the Scottish Court Service, has said that we have a £57 million maintenance backlog across the whole court estate, which is expenditure anticipated over a 5-year period. Cooper Sheriff Court occupies part of that county buildings, which is owned by Fife Council, who are modernising that building at present, including the heating system. Fife Council are incurring costs, some of which are contained within that £470,000, and for which they will no doubt be seeking redress and contribution. I'm seeking further clarity on that. However, it is ironic that the police service in Cooper will be moving into the county buildings next month at the completion of that heating system. At the same time, in that building, of course, the Criminal Social Work Department has existed there for some time. To bring the maintenance backlog issue into context, however, according to Court Services figures I've obtained, Kirkcaldy Sheriff and JP Court alone requires investment of nearly £2 million. So even if every penny of the projected £4.3 million was saved and capital receipts of £2.3 million realised, with a capital budget of in 2014-15 of only £4 million, even with all of John Swinney's additional monies of £12 million going into maintenance, we would still have a huge problem. And the SCS have indicated to me that the only purchaser they can foresee for the Cooper Court in the future are Fife Council, who in turn have said that they have no interest in it. So accordingly, there is a real risk of a white elephant. Presiding Officer, I do not for a moment underestimate the scale of the financial challenges the Scottish Government is facing. And I do think that, given the proposed court structure is not optimum, we need to think about ways of improving it for the time being. I do believe one of the most important areas for exploration is the use of video conferencing technology, which the SCS has already piloted to allow some witnesses to give evidence without actually visiting a court building. There is, however, little detail in the consultation review surrounding video conferencing, and as indeed Consumer Focus Scotland and others have pointed out. It would be helpful if a detailed plan on the use of such technology could be outlined by the SCS, although I understand that some planning is in progress. Even so, whilst I'm sure that there is considerable scope for using technology to make a more modern system efficient, and for the greater use of written advocacy and witness statements in civil business, there will continue to be a role for oral hearings. And we need to look at using buildings other than the designated court building for family contact and residence hearings, for example. Why is it necessary to use formal court buildings, let alone explore local alternatives? The Justice Committee must look at the impact of the change in the jurisdiction of the Sheriff Court to 150k. That will have an impact. We also need to remember Sheriff Taylor's review, his remark in his consultation about the low incidence of civil litigation for its population in Scotland. It's just possible under his proposals that work will increase. And finally, in conclusion, I can't pretend that these proposals are good news. They've not been well received, and while we respect the Government's right to reach an early decision, there remains an important role for this Parliament in further scrutiny. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Now call on Alison McInnes to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, like Lewis MacDonald, I was disturbed to learn last Friday that the Scottish Government had, with barely a week's consideration, decided to accept the complete set of the Court Service's proposals. Now, let me emphasise from the start that the Liberal Democrats are not against change. Where a case has been made and evidence listened to, we are happy to work constructively on delivering an improved service. But I am struggling to see many improvements that are to be found here. Reading through the consultation document, the responses and the final recommendations, I am left with an overwhelming sense that these changes are not about making our court service better. First and foremost, they are about cutting £1 million from the court service's revenue budget. That is not a good way to approach reforming something as fundamentally as important as our courts. We know that the order, once the government lays it, will come to the Justice Committee, and only if the committee rejects it will the whole Parliament be able to vote on the plans. I hope then that my fellow committee members won't mind if I mention their fine words in defence of their local courts, and I trust they will continue to stand up for them so robustly when we get a chance to vote on the order. Peebles Sheriff Court is one of the courts scheduled to be closed. Christine Graham has made a strong argument for its retention. The new facilities there are less than 10 years old. In common with many of the smaller courts mentioned in the consultation, its closure would add a great deal of inconvenience for court users, particularly in terms of travelling time. And Christine Graham also mentions the importance of localism, a subject to which I will return. Moving to the other end of the country, it is proposed that Dingwall Sheriff Court be closed. John Finney rightly highlights that the geography of the Highlands has largely been ignored, and he also recognised his concerns along similar lines about the closing of the court in Wick. In Fife, as we have just heard, Cooper Court is proposed for closure, with most cases being moved to Dundee, and this throws up a number of concerns. Roderick Campbell, in I must say one of the most comprehensive consultation responses that I have read, highlights 14 separate arguments that call into question the closure of Cooper. I hope he won't mind if I add a 15th argument to that list. Shifting trials from Cooper to Dundee does more than simply force people to cross the Tay. It takes the disposal of those cases away from the Fife and Forth Valley Community Justice Authority area, away from the local police command area, away from the local NHS board area, and into an entirely separate local authority area. This surely has huge implications in terms of managing offenders, whether that's in the form of through care, support for rehabilitation, social care, and so on. Before I turn to the North East, I must also mention Rossi. There are, of course, particular problems associated with removing all court services from Bute. And I know that both local MP Alan Reid and MSP Mike Russell are united in their opposition to this closure, and I certainly agree with them. In my own region, Stonehaven and Arbroath Sheriff Courts have been put forward for closure, and I have serious concerns about both of these. The combined business of Forfar and Arbroath totals more than the available sitting days for the court in Forfar. The Court Service document, in common with much of its response to genuine concerns from members of the public and interested organisations, is rather dismissive of this. It notes simply that consolidation of all court business in a single location offers greater opportunity to manage business more efficiently. Similarly, with Stonehaven, a major concern is that if Aberdeen Court is to absorb the extra business, the already overloaded schedule will get still further behind. And yet the Court Service's response is the period between first calling of a summary criminal case and trial in Stonehaven is 10 weeks, as against Aberdeen's 20 weeks. We're working to address reducing Aberdeen's 20 weeks, but how? I can't be the only one for whom this offhand approach to the issue has the alarm bells ringing. Before we even consider closing a court, we have to know that every possible impact has been addressed satisfactorily. I don't believe the Court Service has cast more than a cursory glance at the impacts. And this is even more of a worry given that the Justice Secretary has moved to accepted plans without even drawing breath. At the heart of this is a problem that I've stood in this chamber and brought up time and again, the erosion of local services. Liberal Democrats are passionate about local decision-making and locally delivered services. In contrast, the SNP proved time and again that they're a party of centralisation. The SNP just seem incapable of understanding Scotland's rural communities. Justice is best served when it's delivered locally. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary doesn't find it a bit incongruous standing up and defending these closures today, when next week he'll be leading a debate on redesigning the community justice system. I fear for the content of that redesign, because communities have been wantonly ignored in this one. We're seeing it with the Sheriff and JP courts, and we're seeing it, although we have no control over this aspect, with the High Courts as well. Halting High Court sittings in Dundee and in Inverness and Perth is a further case in point. The Court Service has taken a very blinkered approach to this redesign, and by blithely accepting all the recommendations, the SNP government has once again failed to support Scotland's rural communities. The SNP proposes to move away from a locally delivered justice system. Instead, we'll be left with a kind of regional delivery that incorporates the worst of all worlds. I intend to vote against these plans when they come before the Justice Committee, and I hope that other members from all sides will do likewise and stand up for their local communities.
Thank you very much. I would just like to remind all members that the use of electronic devices is neither welcomed by or courteous to other members during debates. I now call on Christine Graham to be followed by Dave Thompson. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. As others have said, these proposed changes, which many of us regret, are in the context of that 26% cut in the capital budget for the Scottish Government. And also, I'm indebted to my colleague Roddy Campbell for reminding us that £56 million is the budget, is the amount that it would cost to keep some of these buildings in proper form, let alone the heating. And many around this chamber will recognise that some of the sheriff courts really are very old buildings, not fit for purpose, let alone the access of disabled people into their forums. I thought it would be interesting to put this into the UK context, where somebody's already mentioned that there's 93 magistrates' courts and 49 county courts closing in England. But I think something that nobody has mentioned, and it's very important in this time of recession, when we'd all be facing cuts, no matter who's in government, that the legal aid budget in England has been cut by £350 million. And what shocks me, as a former legal aid lawyer in matrimonial cases and family law cases, it's not going to be available in England for divorce, child custody, clinical negligence, welfare, employment, immigration, housing, debt, benefit and education. So what I'm saying is, if you had choices to make, this is a general proposition, if you had choices to make between a place and having somebody to legally represent you, I think you would want somebody to legally represent you, because what's happening south of the border is 1,000 law firms who deal with family actions, custody in England and access to children won't do it anymore. And what we will have, we won't have that in Scotland, but what we'll have down south is party litigants trying to argue for contact with their own children. Now, that cannot be the right way to go. So I think when choices are made, if somebody said to me, choose between giving people legal aid or a place, I'd be giving them legal aid. That's a general point to make on choices being made. Let me just proceed a little bit, because I want to proceed from the point of view of the Justice Committee. Now, others have mentioned this, and in the generality, the Justice Committee will take evidence from professionals and users and others, and we have already put out a call for evidence. And I make that plain now so that others who are not on the website looking at what we're doing all the time hear it, and that we will be taking evidence towards the end of May before any legislation is put before us. But if members will forgive me, I will then move on as the constituency MSP to deal with the specific of Peebles Sheriff Court in my constituency. And I know what Alison McInnes says, but, you know, to say to Alison McInnes, it was going to be shut down by the Liberal Democrats and Labour in previous sessions, and I, amongst others, campaigned for a Sheriff Court to remain in Peebles successfully. So we've been here before. But unfortunately, as the convener sitting on the Justice Committee, I can't have special pleading, and I understand the position of Ian Gray and his submission to the SCS, as I did myself in arguing for localism. I put in a lengthy submission, as you would expect me to do, just like others, challenging, amongst others, access to justice, transport issues and so on. And at that stage, there was a proposal that business might be transferred to Edinburgh. I wasn't having that in any direction of it, because there were complete loss of that important thing. Some people refer to it as localism. I refer to it as shrivel knowledge. Sheriffs know some of the people coming up before them, whether in the criminal or civil courts. They know the professionals round about them. They know what's available. Shrivel knowledge is extremely important to the delivery of justice. Accordingly, and also something I hadn't really thought of before but now know about is, as it's obvious, the local press. Some people are more terrified of being named and shamed in the local press than they are of anything the sheriff can do by way of a fine or a disposal. So the local coverage, so-and-so has been arrested, so-and-so has appeared in court, this has happened to so-and-so, everybody kens about it. That is terribly important. So they have a very important role in themselves. So I've said time and time again, and it wasn't breaking news for you, Lewis MacDonald, if Peebles Sheriff Court closes, I'm ensuring, and I'm putting my neck on the line here, I'm ensuring that Gala has a justice centre, because I want something within the Scottish borders that represents border shrivel knowledge access to justice for the people within the borders and also for the lawyers. And I have to say, the lawyers of Peebles support me in this contention. I would suggest that members also argue the case as firmly as I have. Yes, certainly.
Mr MacDonald.
I'm grateful. Will she, in light of her Plan B, will she agree that her Plan A would require her to vote against the proposal to close Peebles when it comes to the Justice Committee in order to allow the decision to be made in a debate in this chamber?
I'm a realist, and I've listened very carefully to what the lawyers have said in Peebles, and the lawyers in Peebles are actually quite attracted to I hadn't really considered this, attracted to a justice centre in Galashiels, which is central for many more people because it will have the train station and the bus station there, much more central for access. And I'm glad to say that I see in the report back, in the response from the SCS, have listened to me and other members within the borders, just concluding, and that they are saying that they, in line with the vision, they will be pursuing the feasibility of a Borders Justice Centre, and in the interim, any business should go to Selkirk. If that's what it takes, that's what it takes, and that, as I said previously, is my bottom line.
Thank you. I now call on Dave Thompson to be followed by Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The proposals from the Scottish Courts Service, the SCS, will have a significant impact on many of my constituents, particularly the proposals relating to Dingwall, Portree and Inverness. And there are three issues which I want to touch on today. Those relating to Justice of the Peace Courts, Sheriff Courts and also the High Court Circuit. Firstly, the proposed changes to the Justice of the Peace Courts seem sensible, as it is important that we deliver public services at the very best value. Secondly, it is proposed that Dingwall Sheriff Court should close, with business being transferred to Inverness. Now, I accept the need for rationalisation, but I want to turn this into an opportunity. I want, and I have already argued for this, a new justice centre in Dingwall to replace both Dingwall and Inverness courts, as I believe this would provide an ideal solution while freeing up the iconic Inverness Castle to be fully utilised as a tourist attraction. So we can create opportunities out of these situations. It's how you look at them, it's how you deal with them. Therefore, I would accept the closure of Dingwall Sheriff Court in the short term if, in the medium term, and by that I mean within the next few years, we can get a purpose-built, state-of-the-art justice centre in Dingwall to service the whole Inner Murray Firth area. And I would invite all Highland MSPs to back me in this.
Willie Rennie. I thank the member for the intervention. How many years is a few years? How long would they have to wait for this justice centre?
Dave Thompson.
Obviously, we have to make the arguments. And if we do that, then in a relatively short time, we can create a brand new state-of-the-art justice centre in Dingwall, which will be a huge asset to the whole of the Inner Murray Firth. We've got to look at the situation we're in just now in terms of the austerity programme that Willie Rennie's government is pushing from London, and we have to make the best of things. So let's look at it positively, and let's stop all the negativity that we constantly get from these other benches. Now, the advantages of using Dingwall are that land and building costs will be cheaper, the economic benefits to the local area will be greater, and it is no more difficult to get there. In making these changes, we should also be looking to fully utilise technology to reduce the costs and inconvenience of travel. The recent announcement of a major investment of £146 million to create state-of-the-art fibre-optic communications throughout the Highlands and Islands will make video conferencing a realistic prospect for Highland communities and the court system, as mentioned already by the Cabinet Secretary. But finally, I'd like to raise a bigger point about the decision to rule out any future High Court sittings in the Highlands. The proposal from the SCS does suggest that the High Court should be able to sit outside of the three cities of Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Glasgow, but only at Greenock, Paisley, Dumbarton, Livingston and Dunfermline. Now, I believe that Inverness should be added to this High Court designated list, with the new Justice Centre in Dingwall taking over in due course, to ensure a better spread, geographic spread of locations across Scotland.
Alex Ferguson.
I'm grateful to the member for taking the intervention. If we are to have, as appears to be the policy that's coming out of all this, a justice centre in every SNP constituency that's affected by these closures, can you tell me what the cost impact will be on the apparent savings that are to be made?
Well, the member's not listening to what I'm saying. We've got to turn a difficult situation into something positive, and we have to direct our capital spend, such as it is, towards these things. I'm arguing for the best deal for my constituents in the widest possible sense, and looking to a good solution for the future for the Inner Murray Firth area in the Highlands. Now, the SCS proposal in relation to the High Court has been made, it looks like, solely on the basis of distribution of population, and doesn't take geography and topography into account, nor the poorer transport infrastructure in the Highlands and Islands. The Highlands occupy a large proportion of the land mass of Scotland, and it is important that we ensure that we have easy access to the highest form of court in the land. We are all citizens of Scotland, and we all deserve equal treatment. It is also important to protect the status of the Highlands, and that we do not accept the conclusion of what is, in essence, a numbers game. We are investing in Highlands and Islands enterprise to develop the economy in the north. We are investing in the University of the Highlands and Islands to give our young people a better chance. We are investing £146 million in fibre optic broadband in the Highlands to enable Highlanders to engage in the digital economy. It is right, therefore, that we send out the right messages in other spheres, and that will require the High Court to sit in the Highlands when necessary. I will therefore be writing to the Lord President, who will make this decision. It is not a government decision, to make the case for the special circumstances of the Highlands to be taken into account in relation to the High Court. And I would hope that the Justice Committee will also take this and the other matters I have raised fully into account when it looks at this matter.
Many thanks. Now call on Graham Pearson to be followed by Graham Day.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've heard a great deal this afternoon in abstract about the delivering of justice and business of the courts. And indeed, the Cabinet Secretary obviously has some difficulty in hand when he creates a heat shield of the Lord President and the Chief Executive of the Scottish Courts as those who put forward these proposals that he merely feels duty-bound to see through to their conclusions. Those proposals, as far as the south of Scotland are concerned, affect a great number of courts and a great number of communities. Peebles, Duns, Haddington, Jedburgh, Kirkcudbright, Lanark, Selkirk, Stranraer are all affected by these proposals and don't seem to me to be thoughtful reform that look more like judicial vandalism. Of course.
Christine Graham.
It's simply for a point of clarification. Selkirk is not on any list. Selkirk is remaining. It's not one of the recommendations.
Okay, Graham Pearson.
But it is affected by some of the ongoing proposals and knock-on effects. In analysing what the economics might be behind these, I note that as far as Duns Sheriff Court's concerned, it's £21,000 will save per year. Peebles Sheriff Court, £17,000. And lo and behold, Annan JP Court, it's a princely £8,000 per year. What I would offer to the group today is that these proposals are not about the business of the courts. This is not about the Scottish Court Service. It's about people. It's about victims, it's about witnesses, and indeed it's about accused people going to the courts and seeking justice. As someone who's given evidence in courts across Scotland, and indeed it's my unfortunate experience to have given evidence at every sitting of Glasgow High Court for 11 years, and on one occasion for 2 days, I can tell you it is not a welcome experience. And I can tell you too that the experience in the Sheriff Court and Justice of the Peace Courts can be just as tortuous. I have not in 40 years been met by a witness outside a court who said, Thank you, Mr Pearson, for that wonderful experience. If you ever need me again, please phone. Indeed, the response was somewhat otherwise. So I am concerned these changes will have a very detrimental effect on vulnerable people, on those who are disabled, on the elderly and those who suffer in poverty. Because travelling 18 miles or more extra to a court might seem insignificant to many of us with cars, but those who rely on public transport, it can prove extremely difficult. I examined the impact at Duns Court to see what would happen there, and it's an additional journey of 30 miles to Jedburgh. It will mean obtaining a bus at 7:30 in the morning in order to be at Jedburgh in time for court, with the likelihood that you'll share that transport on many occasions with the very people you seek either to complain about or give evidence in relation to. That's a significant journey to spend in the company of people that you'd much rather not see. The Scottish Government has heralded the introduction of live video links and conferencing networks across the country, particularly for the northern courts, as they are described. The history in this regard is not good. We've had the ability to use video conferencing for over a decade now in Scotland. And certainly, even after a number of questioning of the Cabinet Secretary in committee, there doesn't seem to be much happening in that regard. And indeed, only yesterday at Justice Committee, as was previously alluded to in one presentation to the Chamber, Murdo MacLeod QC and Peter Lockhart indicated many difficulties which severely limit the ability of lawyers and judges to effectively question witnesses and obtain justice for the courts. The SNP members will claim that they've simply accepted the recommendations made by the Scottish Court Service and the Lord President. But there's more to be done here. We need to think of those witnesses and those victims who need to use this service, who rely on the local delivery of that service. And in every other regard of what we try to do in public life, we take the service to the public, not cause the public the inconvenience at the most stressful time in their lives to travel to a strange environment and feel vulnerable and at risk. Many of them do not seek that experience. I am concerned in relation to the impact from these recommendations. I worry about the impact it will have in obtaining witnesses to come forward and offer their evidence. And I do hope that those backbench members of the Scottish Nationalist Party who can have an impact at Justice Committee in ensuring that these proposals are voted down will find the means to vote and ensure that we have a proper consultation and some reform for our courts for the future. I support Lewis MacDonald's motion.
Thank you very much. I'll call on Graham Day to be followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you. Section 1.7 of the document Shaping Scotland's Court Services explains quite clearly the drivers behind the moves we are debating today. It states, and I quote, "We need a court structure that, in providing access to justice for the people of Scotland, does three things: reflect the planned reforms to the justice system, improve the facilities and services for court users, and be affordable in the long term." Presiding Officer, that's one small section of the document sums up the challenges faced by those seeking to plot an appropriate way forward for the delivery of justice in Scotland. Of course, that process must be financially sustainable, and we all surely must recognise both that the money available to the SCS has been reduced and that the cause of this reduction has been the funding afforded the Scottish Government by Westminster being cut. It must also be in keeping with the future nature of the justice system and be delivered in appropriate surroundings. But whilst I agree with all three of these points, as things stand, what is proposed as it relates to my own constituency does not entirely get us there. Now, everyone who takes an interest in this issue has to be realistic in expectations of what can be delivered within the budgetary constraints the SCS and the Scottish Government are having to wrestle with. But I do want to focus attention on an aspect of closing the court in Arbroath, which raises a concern that the SCS has not, in my view, adequately recognised. There are presently 2 courts in Angus, and the case has been made for the closure of one. Originally, this was to have been Forfar, but following discussions with the legal profession, and I'm not saying those were necessarily what influenced the decision, there was a change of heart and Arbroath was targeted. But it's a fact that whichever court closes, some users face the same potential difficulty in accessing the surviving facility if their only means of doing so is public transport. And I will return to that issue later in my contribution. In the meantime, for the purposes of clarity, it should be acknowledged that whatever the perceived rights and wrongs of the decision to close Arbroath, there has been no local campaign mounted to oppose. And I speak as a constituency MSP who, since August of last year and before the launch of the formal consultation, has been very much involved in this. Along with my MSP colleague Nigel Donn and Mike Weir MP, I met with the Society of Procurators and Solicitors of Angus on 2 separate occasions. I engaged directly with the SCS on behalf of the Society to secure information they required to form a view on the matter, and held discussions with Tayside Police on the possible impact on local policing if one of the county's courts was to shut. Can I say, however, Presiding Officer, that the very limited opposition to the closure proposal that I've encountered has been restricted almost entirely to those with a direct and immediate interest in it, and even then it's neither strong nor particularly vocal. The Society, for example, in the end did not take a collective view on the matter, and the Angus proposals attracted just 20 consultation responses when the average specific to a particular location across Scotland was more than double that. So why the lack of clamour to retain a court presence in Arbroath? The simple fact is that the existing court is, from a public policing and high street shopkeeping perspective, in the wrong place. I say that not to justify the closure decision, because I, along with Mike Weir, am concerned about the difficulties that people living on the coastal strip, which Arbroath services, may encounter in getting to Forfar if they have to depend on public transport. And I also recognise that there may be a degree of economic downside to this proposal for Arbroath High Street, albeit that will, owing to particularly local circumstances, I believe be more than mitigated by an improved shopper footfall. I say this simply as a statement of fact. The court provision in Arbroath is contained within a cramped building, offering no further room for expansion. Vehicles transporting prisoners to and from court are having to drop and park on the high street itself, and groups of friends and relatives of accused persons are loitering outside the building ahead of business taking place. The result of this, local shopkeepers are left feeling their businesses are being impacted upon negatively by having an undesirable element hanging about the area. Older folk are avoiding going to the High Street Post Office because they're intimidated by that presence, and following the intervention of the local MSP, the police have had to deploy additional resources in the vicinity of the court to help address these issues. Now, in an ideal world, it would be great if we in Arbroath could be provided with a new fit-for-purpose court facility, the location of which did not impact negatively on sections of society or impinge on the police's ability to go about their general work. But we live in a far from ideal world. The Scottish Government's budget has been slashed, and there are inevitable consequences from that. Now, I won't, if you don't mind, I want to make some points, if I may. Those charged with delivering justice in the future also believe that the process is best served by taking a different direction, and I think we have to respect that opinion. That said, I do want to highlight to the Justice Committee and the Cabinet Secretary the matter of ready access and accompanying potential issues emanating from the closure of an Angus court, and the hope that this can be woven into consideration that's yet to be given to the proposals by the committee. The document states that across Scotland the number of people who will be directly affected by court closures in terms of additional travel and inconvenience will be very small. I accept that, but I do take issue with the comment contained within paragraph 8.9, which states people resident in Arbroath commute more frequently to the larger population centres to access other services, including specialist medical services, and as for most people, a visit to the Sheriff Court is a relatively rare event. We consider the journey from Arbroath to Forfar to be a reasonable undertaking. Well, there are 3 ready means of getting to and from Dundee: private car, bus and the train, and specific to medical services, there's also a direct bus service from Arbroath to Nine Wells. The options between the town and Forfar are restricted to car and a limited direct bus service. And if you live further down the coastal strip in Carnoustie or Montefieth, which are also presently served by Arbroath, there is little or no direct public transport provision to Forfar. In this regard, I think we do need the SCS to give some real thought to how they can mitigate the impact of closure of Arbroath if that goes ahead. Will they, for example, in scheduling cases involving individuals from the coastal strip, take account of what public transport provision exists and the timing of its availability? And I further hope that in their consideration of the proposals, the Justice Committee will be able to secure from the SCS an understanding of what thought has been given to avoidance of the, albeit probably rare occurrence, of the accused, the alleged victim and the various witnesses journeying to proceedings on the same rural bus, with the potential difficulties that might present. I certainly hope for an opportunity to raise these points directly with the SCS myself.
Thanks very much. I now call on Claire Baker to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. When the proposals from the Scottish Court Service were initially leaked in December 2011, I raised concerns over the future of Cooper Sheriff Court. When my colleague Ian Gray held a members' debate in February last year over the internal document, I again raised concerns over the closure of Cooper Sheriff Court, in particular highlighting concerns over local access to justice and the economic impact of closure. At the time, members were told that the debate was premature and there were no proposals to close courts, and we had to wait for the consultation before drawing conclusions. When the consultation was finally published, it was actually worse for Fife than the floated proposals. Not only was Cooper identified for closure, but it also proposed ending jury trials at Kirkcaldy and holding them only in Dunfermline. Just briefly, I've got...
Can I add to that that the drug court is also being closed, which is a significant loss? It's the only non-urban drug court in Europe.
Thanks for the intervention. That's an issue I will turn to later in my comments. I've always felt these proposals were flawed and driven by financial pressure, not only what is best for the delivery of justice in Fife. By 2015, the Court Service running cost budget will reduce by 20% in real terms, and the capital budget will reduce from £20 million to £4 million. So, following the defence that closures were due to poor facilities and crumbling buildings that the capital budget couldn't meet, I wanted to see the experience for myself from the witness waiting areas to the cells. So, first I went to a public meeting at Cooper Sheriff Court. These buildings have a number of services located there, with the police about to move in. Unfortunately, it was clear at that meeting the decision to close Cooper had all but been taken by the Scottish Court Service. The condition of the building was a key determining factor identified by the Scottish Court Service. However, as Rod Campbell and others have identified, there are questions over who has to meet the costs and whether the £470,000 maintenance backlog costs, as quoted by the Scottish Court Service, are accurate, and these are figures that were certainly challenged by people at the public meeting. In addition, the annual running costs of that building are less than £50,000 a year, and once the additional costs of moving to Dundee are taken into consideration, there are question marks over whether any money will actually be saved. The consultation did not include a cost-benefit analysis of closure. And in addition to costs, there is an impact the court closure will have on Cooper Town Centre. And at the centre of all this is the impact it will have on victims and witnesses. There will be additional strain, in more ways than one, put on staff and local people using the service, particularly in relation to transport. Moving the business of the Sheriff Court to Dundee also moves this part of Fife out of the Fife and Forth Valley Community Justice Authority, a point that was made by Alison McInnes. These proposals are flawed and will bring to an end years of justice being delivered in Cooper. This centralising agenda will also impact heavily on a rural town and represent a significant loss of local services. So, in addition to the closure of Cooper, the consultation also proposes ending jury trials in Kirkcaldy Sheriff Court and moving them all to Dunfermline. Now, when you consider where the business takes place, in the past year, Kirkcaldy held almost 3 times as many jury trials as Dunfermline, sat for almost twice as many days, and issued twice the number of indictments. Dunfermline Sheriff Court will see the number of jury trials increase dramatically, and the consultation document itself suggests that if justice services were to be centralised in Fife, it would be in Kirkcaldy. But I'm not convinced that either Sheriff Court could accommodate the needs of Fife alone. I'm not convinced that Dunfermline can cope with such an increase, both in terms of capacity and workload. This has the potential to lead to an increase in the waiting period for a jury trial to be called, with such delays only adding to what is a stressful time for victims and witnesses. So again, however, the condition of the building in Kirkcaldy and the provision for witnesses were cited as reasons for this change. So I visited both Sheriff Courts before Christmas to compare the provision and took the opportunity to speak to people who worked in both courts. And I would like to thank the Scottish Court Service for facilitating these visits. I found them very valuable. It is true that Kirkcaldy is in need of an upgrade. There are features of the building that are not ideal. Dunfermline has more modern facilities. However, the features that are highlighted in Kirkcaldy as poor will still be used by witnesses, victims and staff. Moving jury trials will not change this. The building will still be used. And the difference in self-provision was particularly highlighted, but in talking to people who work in the system, there were advantages and disadvantages to both. For example, while Dunfermline has direct access from the cells to the court, this is the only access from the court to the cells. So as the courts become busier, sessions will be interrupted as solicitors have to go through sessions in order to speak to their clients. So overwhelmingly, the people I spoke to felt that, on balance, the weaknesses of Kirkcaldy Sheriff Court were far outweighed by the positives of continuing jury trials there. My principal concern is the impact this move will have on access to local justice. Kirkcaldy serves the surrounding area, including Leavenmouth and Glenrothes. For example, Leavenmouth has some of the lowest rates of car ownership in Scotland. And in that area, public transport to Dunfermline can be time-consuming and costly. This presents challenges for people with caring responsibilities and a significant concern as the court has a large amount of family cases. A number of issues have also been raised. Removing jury trial and family cases to Dunfermline will lead to a lack of continuity in the solicitors representing people. It takes away the flexibility of the solicitors that they can provide in Kirkcaldy, which is particularly concerning when sensitive family cases are dealt with. Also, the removal of jury trials will reduce the breadth of experience of the sheriff and will lead to a risk that Kirkcaldy becomes a less attractive place for a sheriff to be based. So, in addition to the diminution of justice services in Kirkcaldy and Cooper, we have also recently learned that the funding for the Fife Drugs Court is being stopped and the service has been run down. There has been no consultation. This will bring an end to a good service that works, and it will put additional strain on other services. Presiding Officer, we are seeing a combination of decisions which is leading to justice. We are seeing a combination of decisions which is leading to justice in Fife being sold short by the Scottish Government, and again, the most vulnerable in our communities will be let down.
Many thanks. Now call on John Mason, after which we'll move to closing speeches.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The comments I make today would be mainly focusing on finance. Now, I accept that some people, and maybe some people in the legal profession, and maybe even some people here, would say that we must have a perfect legal system no matter what it costs. There should be courts in every village, and the courts should be able to take as long as they like to make decisions, because after all, it's justice that matters more than money. Well, I do accept that a debate like this should not be just about money, but neither can it be without reference to money. Of course, we want the courts to be as local as possible and to respect historical importance of certain areas. But all of our budgets are under pressure from cuts, for example, the capital budget by 26%. So in the face of it, every budget needs to be cut. This is not just the starting point as a parliament, for the government, but for the parliament as a whole. And I do find it deeply insulting that Ian Gray refers to, I think, my profession and civil servants as bean counters, as if we are some kind of second-rate citizens because we actually count up the money. I think he should perhaps remember that it was his government that forgot to count up the money and got this country into the mess it's in. Now, these proposals would save, I believe, some £1 million per year in running costs and £3 million in maintenance costs, and that seems fairly positive to me. Yes?
Ian Gray.
Civil servants and other officials have to undertake the work to produce the budgets which are demanded of them. But the point is that, in the end, this is a ministerial decision, and the Cabinet Secretary has responsibility for taking that based on the wider impact both on justice and on Scotland's communities. That was the point I was making, and I stand by it.
John Mason.
Point you were making, but I did not hear the point that we all have to live within our means. I think the opposition party needs to think about this and really gets to grip with it, that if they want more money in one area, then they have to suggest getting less money somewhere else. My constituents have to live within their means, especially now that they're having the bedroom tax and all this ridiculous stuff taken off them. This government, this parliament, needs to live within its means as well. Very briefly.
Alison McInnes. I wonder if the member was in the chamber just 2 hours ago when the Transport Minister boasted about how he had managed to find £4.6 million just recently to give to Scotland's canals for their Living on Water initiative, for houseboats. This is about choices. What the opposition are debating today is that, along with a devolved budget from Westminster, came devolved decision-making, and that decision-making sits with the Minister.
John Mason.
Well, I think she makes the right point. She makes the point that it's about choices. And if we can get people living on canals, I am totally supportive of that. And Christine Graham also said we have to make a choice, as I understood it, between legal aid and buildings. And I would support choice of legal aid over and against buildings. And I was disappointed that neither she nor, I think, Margaret Mitchell managed to give us really any other suggestions as to where the money might come from.
Margaret Mitchell. Given the line coming from the front bench that they're duty-bound to follow the advice and the proposals of SCS, wouldn't a place to save money be by cutting these?
Mrs Mitchell, I'm afraid we can't hear you.
Because you're not wouldn't a saving be to cut the Cabinet Secretary post and the Minister's post, because officials could easily just follow their advice? John Mason.
Yes, I did hear some of that. I think that was a slightly strange idea, especially coming from a party that is cutting the actual budget for the whole country. But I mean, ordinary people in my constituency have to live within their means. This Parliament, this Government has to live within its means. In the budget process, the Finance Committee heard lots of ideas about how to spend more money, and I think we've had that again today. Lots of good ideas, but not really where we're going to get the money from. And if we heard less about where the money was to come from, we should hear more about where the money is to come from, and if it's to be cutting colleges or cutting health or cutting local government, then I think the opposition parties need to be a bit more straightforward about that, and to give the Greens their due, they tend to be a little bit more straightforward. So again, with the area of courts and justice, the starting point is that we need to make cuts, and if it's not in the way that's proposed today, we need to have suggestions from other parties as to where that money is to come from, either within the justice budget or in other departments. For example, does Labour think, again, that we should cut college or health budgets and put more into justice? I have not heard that today, Nov. I think we've had quite enough interventions, thank you. The reality is that we have become a less localised society. We travel more to bigger schools, bigger shops, bigger cinemas. And in many ways, I do not think that is always a good thing. And we've debated in this chamber before the value of local organisations, local food production, local colleges, local shops, local leisure centres. All of these things we like. But we are where we are, and the centres of population are not where they used to be, and the justice and courts cannot stand apart from shifts in society. Speaking as an accountant, I have seen that annual accounts and audits have had to shift with the times and modern demands. Annual accounts and audits often have to be finished within days of a year-end. I'm not saying that is always good. There needs to be time for reflection. But I do sometimes get the impression that the legal profession has not been so keen on updating and working more efficiently and to timescales that fit the modern world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to closing speeches, and I remind all members, if they've participated in the debate, they should be in the chamber. Call on Alex Ferguson. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This debate has raised many concerns which have, on the whole, I think accurately reflected the concerns that was raised by those 95% of respondents who took part in the consultation on these proposals. Proposals which, as we have heard, will result in the closure of a fifth of Scotland's sheriff courts, 13 JP courts, the disestablishment of 3 further JP courts, and the reduction in the High Court circuit. Now, whatever else you might think of these proposals, you cannot deny that they will have a major impact on local communities, the length and breadth of our country. In anybody's language, these are massive changes, which, however much the Cabinet Secretary might wish to argue otherwise, are the choice of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Government alone. It is no secret that I wish to see much greater responsibility devolved to this Parliament. But the beauty of devolution, even in its current form, is that it allows almost total flexibility as to how our fairly considerable resources are spent to address specific Scottish issues. And in this case, the Scottish Government has chosen to implement these massive changes. It did not have to do so. It has chosen to do so, as John Mason has just agreed. Now, in response to one of the many questions that was put to him during topical questions on Tuesday, the 16th of April last week, the Cabinet Secretary said, "I think local justice is important." I don't think any of us would disagree with that. And I want to spend just a little time looking at the impact these closures are likely to have on local justice, because, as many members have pointed out, the biggest impact of these closures is going to be on the witnesses and others whose willing participation in the process is so vital to ensuring that the justice system actually delivers justice for both the victim and the perpetrators of any crime. Presiding Officer, I've been involved in a constituency case this year in which a constituent was approached and asked to give evidence against a neighbour who had been charged with benefit fraud. My constituent willingly agreed and looked forward, if that is the right expression, to playing a meaningful part in bringing to justice someone who had allegedly committed a fraudulent act. The problem is that my constituent has to make very complex arrangements for another member of the family to take time off from work and to travel a very considerable distance in order to look after their elderly and very, very frail mother whenever a court appearance is scheduled. Now, so far, my constituent has been asked to and gone to court 4 times on 4 separate occasions, having had to make these difficult arrangements, only to find that the case has been deferred for one legal reason or another. To say that they are, frankly, sick to the back teeth with this due process would be to considerably understate their feelings. And the Procurator Fiscal has now been informed that the care of the mother will from now on take precedence over any requested court appearance. In short, a once willing participant in the justice system is no longer as willing to participate. Now, the reason I want to share that story with the Chamber is to try to underline the fact that people already put up with a great deal of inconvenience to play their part in ensuring that justice is done, as Graham Pearson put so eloquently in his speech. But there is clearly a limit beyond which people are just not prepared to go. And my contention is quite simply that these closures will bring that limit a lot closer for people in Rothesay, for example, who will have to take an 80-minute journey partly by ferry to get to Greenock, for people in Helmsdale, where witnesses will now have to travel the 34 miles to Tain, and in Kirkcudbright, in my own constituency, from where those involved will have to travel to Dumfries, a not inconsiderable 45-minute journey at best. And I would point out that that particular closure, along with that in Annan, was robustly opposed by Dumfries and Galloway Council. So we should not labour under any illusions that it is just awkward individuals who are opposing these proposals. There is nothing about these proposals that is going to encourage people to participate in the justice system and thus help to deliver justice to the victims of those who break the law. Now, there's one other point that members have raised, but I want to highlight, Presiding Officer, and that's the economic aspect of these closures. That's been, again, raised by several members and indeed came up during the questions last week. And that's an aspect to which a due cognizance really should be given. The courts bring a significant impact, a significant economic boost to the towns in which they are located, the county towns, as many of them are. As anyone even half acquainted with rural Scotland knows full well, these towns survive on a very fragile economy, and these closures will have a disproportionately negative impact on those economies. And I do hope the Scottish Government has taken that fully into account and will continue to do so as it proceeds with its plans, as Lewis MacDonald asked it to do just last week and again today. Presiding Officer, as Margaret Mitchell said in her opening speech, there is surely something wrong when a government that is undertaking this extensive closure programme is simultaneously introducing a Victims and Witnesses Bill that aims to, and I quote, put victims' interests at the heart of improvement to the justice system and will help to make what is often the most difficult episode in someone's life a bit easier. Now, as an example of giving with one hand and taking away with the other, I think you would be hard-pressed to find better. It is somewhat tragic, I think, that a government which purports to be a listening government that believes in consultation has apparently chosen to turn a deaf ear to 95% of the respondents to that consultation. On this evidence, Presiding Officer, the consultation would appear to have been purely a tick-box exercise, or, as Ian Gray put it, a complete sham. And the views of the vast majority appear to be simply going to be cast aside. We have already seen the centralising of our country's police force and our fire service. It rather looks as if we are now appearing to be witnessing the centralisation of our justice system. There have been some really good speeches in this debate, Presiding Officer, notably by Ian Gray, Roderick Campbell and Alison McInnes, cross-party on these issues. They have all suggested that much more thought is needed on these proposals. I would entirely endorse that position, and I really hope that that cry will be heeded. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Rosanna Cunningham with a generous 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I apologise at the start for my slight lateness at the beginning of the debate. The Presiding Officer was quite correct in suspecting that I had become overly focused on the 3:10 start, and I accept her chiding of me. Can I say that I've listened...
Can I interrupt a moment to say you were not the only one?
Oh, well, I'm taking the opportunity to apologise. I have listened with very great interest to the debate this afternoon, and I think, with my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary, would have to readily acknowledge the genuine concerns expressed by members from all parts of the Chamber about the closure of some of the Sheriff and Justice of the Peace courts, although in fact most of the debate has been about the Sheriff Court closures rather than the Justice of the Peace Court closures. As Lord Gill, the Lord President of the Court of Session, has said, determining the future shape of Scotland's court structure is a serious responsibility. Doing so against a backdrop of significant change and in a time of severe pressure on public finances is a difficult task with few easy answers. He did go on, however, to say that he was confident that the proposals will contribute significantly to the success of the forthcoming civil justice reforms. And it's important to remember that these proposals are indeed part of a wider set of reforms to create a modern justice system that is fair and accessible, cost-effective and efficient, and that better meets the needs of the people of Scotland. The wider reforms, both civil and criminal, recommended in the reviews by Lord Gill, Lord Carloway and Sheriff Principal Bowen, will ensure that cases are more effectively managed, reducing both wasted time and the number of hearings required for each case. These outcomes cannot be fully achieved unless we rationalise the estate by taking business out of courts that are underused or which duplicate provision in an area. It is also important to remember that the volume of business carried out in the Sheriff Courts recommended for closure is in total only around 5% of total business. Overall, court business is down, with civil business in the Sheriff Courts down 13% in 2011-12 compared with 2010-11.
Margaret Mitchell.
Except that 5% represents 12,500 cases.
Minister?
Yes, but it's 5%. There's a 95% that isn't affected. I was saying that the Sheriff Courts are down, civil business in the Sheriff Courts is down 13%, and crime at a 37-year low. All of this will feed into the courts and it will begin to show. The Scottish Court Service is confident that the transferred business can be assimilated without difficulty in a smaller number of better equipped courts with modern facilities for victims, witnesses and jurors. And the Court Service isn't immune from the financial pressures which affect all public bodies, even though it is independent of government. The Service is seeking to save £4.5 million from its revenue budget, and they estimate that the proposals will save almost £1 million per annum and an estimated backlog maintenance of almost £3 million. Yes.
SNP backbenchers have obviously made a promise about a shiny new justice centre in each of their constituencies. Can she tell us more about that promise?
Minister? I rather suspect many SNP backbenchers would wish that Willie Rennie was making a correct statement, but he's not. Ministers are satisfied that the Scottish Court Service has considered their options carefully against the principles of access to justice set out by the judiciary. They stipulated that court users should be able to get to court by public transport before their case proceeds and should be able to return home by public transport on the same day. And this may mean that some cases will be set for later in the court day, but SCS are confident that they will be able to satisfy that requirement. There has also been a large court closure programme in England and Wales, which has involved the closure of 93 magistrates' courts and 49 county courts. And I see the Conservative members rolling their eyes at each other, but I find it extraordinary that apparently is not to be criticised, but in fact the court closure programme here is. I need to press on. It simply costs too much to maintain old buildings which are not suitable for courts in the 21st century and which do not provide modern facilities for those having business in the courts. Now, some critics of the closures have suggested that the closing of a sheriff court in a high street will also have an adverse effect on the economy of towns where the court is being closed. But the fact is that where the court is only sitting on certain days and rarely for a full day, even when it does sit, the economic benefits of the court to that town may in fact be negligible. Furthermore, when the building is converted to an alternative use, it may actually have a more substantial economic benefit to that community, which I think was the point that my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary, was making about Linlithgow. It has also been alleged that firms of solicitors will struggle if a local sheriff court is closed, but where there are few cases being raised in a sheriff court, and there are a number of courts where that is exactly the situation, it is extremely unlikely that local lawyers will be relying on the continued existence of that court for the well-being of their business, and will likely have already diversified into many other areas of law. Now, a number of members have spoken in this debate, and understandably most have focused on proposed closures in their own local areas, and that does include SNP backbenchers, and we would expect nothing else. However, the consequences of taking that totally non-strategic approach would result in no closures of any court anywhere ever. It is simply not a tenable position for any government to take, although a number of members do seem to be of that view. No, I need to press on. I've only got a minute and 40 seconds. Remarkably, however, that includes Margaret Mitchell, Alec Ferguson and Alison McInnes, despite their own government south of the border taking a very different position. Presumably their position in this chamber is that court closures England good, court closures Scotland bad. Now, Ian Gray spoke very passionately about his own sheriff court in Haddington, and I've heard him speak on this before. But in his desire to blame the Cabinet Secretary as an individual, he blithely sweeps aside the year-long consultation of the Scottish Court Service, whose job this is, of course. And I'm sorry, but I don't remember who it was that raised the issue of the drugs court. I think that was Richard Simpson. That is a matter entirely for the Sheriff Principal. It is his decision, and that is the position that the member needs to accept. Now, Richard Simpson also became very animated during the debate, but I note that he made no submission to the consultation. No doubt he overlooked that last year. Graham Pearson and a number of others, including Alec Ferguson, talked about the vast majority, talked about the problems and the difficulties that people will have, but for the vast majority of court users, there will be no additional travel requirements as a consequence of these proposals. And there were constant references from a sedentary position on the Labour benches that were only talking about £1 million, as if that was an utterly negligible amount of money. But Labour members are not quite so cavalier when it comes to their own Cuts Commission, and I notice that my colleague John Mason spotted that as well. Now, I'm sorry, I have run out of time.
There is time available if you wish, but it's entirely your choice.
Thank you. Then I will deal with some of the other points that have been raised, including the point raised by Jenny Mara about the transfer of cases to the Sheriff Court as a result of forthcoming reforms. The reforms to move lower value claims from Court of Session to Sheriff Courts will affect around 3,000 cases. Sheriff Courts already deal with over 94% of all civil cases, and there will also be a personal injury court which will handle most of the cases involved. Lewis MacDonald raised the issue of delays in court, but of course that's not just about court availability, and Lewis MacDonald knows that. There are many factors that contribute to delays. And I need to close now. Many of Scotland's courts date from Victorian times and are simply not fit for purpose in the 21st century. Many are underused. Others lie closer to bigger courts where business will be scheduled more efficiently in terms of court and shrivel time. Ministers believe that the recommendations of the Scottish Court Service for the future shape of Scotland's courts will better meet the needs of the people of Scotland. Presiding Officer, I agree with my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary, in his moving the amendment to the motion.
Thank you very much. I now call on Jenny Mara to wind up the debate, and you have until 5:29, Ms Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I, like the Minister, also accept your chiding? I very sincerely apologise for being slightly late to the Chamber this afternoon. Just over 2 years ago, the Lord President announced something historic may be happening in our courts. It was not, in his own words, met with any major resistance, yet he acknowledged the change was significant. For the first time in over 3 decades, the Lord President was considering opening courts on a Saturday to ease their caseload. The reason was cadre. In the Lord President's eyes, that one judgment was enough to necessitate the weekend opening of our courts, because there was no indication of how much the caseload would increase. And we are still in a period of reflection on the cadre judgment. It is too early to assess its legacy, but if the reaction from the Lord President tells us anything, it is this: that we cannot look at courts and the amount of business in our courts in a silo on their own. The court's role is not defined by arbitrary number of sitting days, caseloads of years gone by, or indeed by savings targets. So when the Cabinet Secretary justifies his decision by telling us these courts don't sit for enough days or they don't deal with enough cases, I would suggest to him that he needs to look under this and ask himself why that is the case. He needs to ask whether it is right that we have a system where between 2011 and 2012 the arrears from antisocial behaviour penalties rose from £600,000 to £1.1 million. A system where, in 1 year, 98,000 crimes solved by police result in fines being given instead of court appearances, and where 36,000 of these fines never get paid. He needs to ask whether he is satisfied that the amount of uncollected fines in our justice system from just 1 year amounts to more than the savings he wants to make by closing all of these courts across Scotland. If the Cabinet Secretary could put the resources of his government and the court service to collecting these fines, he would find that he would have over £1 million extra in his budget and he would not have to close one of these courts across the country. Yes.
Cabinet Secretary. That the principal difficulty faced by fines enforcement officers is the inability to access welfare benefits, which are currently reserved to Westminster. That the solution would actually be to have these powers here in Scotland so that matters could be addressed and dealt with, as well as not having the iniquity of the bedroom tax foisted upon our poorest and most vulnerable.
Jenny Mara. Independence will solve all, presiding officer, it seems. I would ask the Cabinet Secretary why he persists in issuing these fines if they're not collectible in a devolved Scotland, if it's only under independence that they'll be collectible. It's an absolutely preposterous suggestion. Now, these are the policy choices of this SNP government, because instead of prosecuting cases through our courts, which is giving up on our communities, failing to try unacceptable behaviour and hold people accountable in front of their peers, this government is content to see fines issued with little hope of seeing them paid. Fines mean less court cases, and less court cases mean less courts. And it is a cynical mindset that completely ignores the value of accessible local justice, and that is the point that we are arguing today. And this, Cabinet Secretary, is built on a false pretence. Because when we look at some of the government's forthcoming legislation, we see that the SNP are bringing forward measures that will actually increase the number of cases going through our courts again. As one consultation response stated, an increase in the jurisdiction of sheriff courts to £150,000 in civil affairs could cause an overload to civil business in Dundee, such that the closure of Cooper's Sheriff Court would seem ill-advised. Not my words, presiding officer, but the words of Rod Campbell, SNP MSP for North East Fife. And he is right, because the upcoming Courts Reform Scotland Bill, which was published in January, will see many more cases transferred from sheriff courts. Personal injury cases will come from the Court of Session down to the sheriff courts, increasing business. And I would invite the Cabinet Secretary to deny that that is the intended consequence of this piece of legislation. But with no intention to add to the number of courts in Dundee Sheriff Court, how are they meant to handle the extra caseload? And we've heard today of all the other cases that will be coming in from the courts that he is closing into Dundee. And what of proposals like that to abolish corroboration? Has the government made any assessment how this would impact the number of cases that would come to court, because the Lord President was concerned about the number of cases, the increase as a result of cadre, and such a significant law reform such as the abolition of corroboration would probably have a similar effect. The simple truth is that a narrow view of court demand cannot predict their future need, particularly when this government is legislating to increase that demand, not decrease it. Labour recognises the role that courts play in our communities. They are essential not just to justice being done, but also to justice being seen to be done. They instil public confidence in the safety of our communities. They help support local economies, as we have heard today, through direct jobs and indirectly through surrounding law firms, who go on to support local shops and restaurants. And many of these courts have been part of our towns and cities for hundreds of years. It is of little surprise, Presiding Officer, that 95% of consultation responses were against these proposals. And if the Chamber will allow me, I think I will tell you what some of them had to say. In response to the consultation, Graham Day, SNP MSP for Angus South, the limited nature of public transport could give rise to situations where the accused, the victim or the witness involved in a case would be making their way on the same bus, posing very obvious potential problems. Paul Wheelhouse, SNP MSP for South of Scotland. Aside from the inconvenience and added expense to legal professionals, moving business would inevitably have a negative economic impact. Nigel Donn, MSP for Angus North and the Mearns. I see no evidence that cases could not continue to be heard in Stonehaven. It is just as easy to travel from Stonehaven as from it. Overall, I suggest the case for closing Stonehaven Court has not yet been made. Presiding Officer, if I can briefly turn to some of the excellent contributions in this afternoon's debate. Alison McInnes, I think, made a very powerful point about the difficulty with Cooper Sheriff Court closing and cases being shifted to Dundee, because you are taking decisions out of the local authorities' control, away from the in a second Cabinet Secretary, away from the social workers and the police, the NHS and the offender management provision in that community, and that is about community justice. Yes, Cabinet Secretary.
The member seems to be implying that no court should close and that the matter will be dreadful. Can I just point out that in Duns, as was pointed out to Mr Lamont last time, the number of trials in which evidence was led in the year 2012 was 12. The number of ordinary proofs which proceeded was 0. Does the member really suggest that 12 trials with a limited number of witnesses is going to cause huge inconvenience, given the likelihood is that many of them will probably relate to matters that took place in the A1 and they won't come from Berwickshire?
Jenny Mara.
Presiding Officer, with respect, I have just spent the last 8 minutes making the case that the Cabinet Secretary's government is actually legislating to increase the amount of business that will go through the courts. And so this programme of closures is far too early, and I would ask the government today to seriously consider putting it on hold. If I can turn to some of the other points that were made. Graham Day, I think, made a very good contribution to highlight the transport links to Forfar, and I think this is something that we will be able to consider in the Justice Committee. And Claire Baker and Richard Simpson made a very important point about the impact of the drug court in Fife being closed with no consultation after funding cuts from this SNP government. And if I can summarise with Ian Gray. Yes, Cabinet Secretary.
Is the member not aware that the reason for the closure of the drugs court in Fife is the position taken by the Sheriff Principal that he does not feel that the court system can be operated that way, and it's his call, and his call alone, nothing to do with funding?
Jenny Mara.
Presiding Officer, I really feel that the Cabinet Secretary needs to take some responsibility in this debate for the decisions that he is making. Order. He can blame the Sheriff Principal, he can blame the Scottish Court Service, he can blame the Lord President, but at the end of the day, it is £1 million of savings that could actually be realised if he went out and collected the fines that are in our system.
Must ask you to begin concluding.
Presiding Officer, local members everywhere recognise that court closures mean emptier...
Order. Can we hear the member, please?
...mean emptier town centres, further travel for victims and witnesses, and the loss of jobs in their communities, all in the name of £1.3 million worth of savings, which I've already told the Cabinet Secretary where he can find. But it is the price of poor choices in our justice system, where fines are valued more than the role of good local justice, and a false pretence that our courts will never again see higher caseloads, despite this very government legislating for exactly that. The Scottish Government needs to reassess the route it is taking our justice system down before more communities are disenfranchised by SNP choices. I would ask every member across this chamber that has a court under threat of closure to vote with their conscience tonight and to stand up for the principle of fair access to local justice that their constituents deserve.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate. And can I thank both Rosanna Cunningham and Jenny Mara for their courtesy in apologising to the Chamber for being slightly late for the start of the debate. We now move to the next item of business, and that is consideration of Business Motion 6309 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme, and I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 6309.
Formally moved.
Thank you. No member is asked to speak against the motion, and therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 6309 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 6311 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a timetable for consideration of the Forth Road Bridge Bill at Stage 2. Could I ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 6311.
Moved.
Thank you. No members asked to speak against the motion, and therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 6311 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 6316 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a timetable for consideration of the Post-16 Education Scotland Bill at Stage 2. And again, could I ask any member who wishes to speak against that motion to press the request to speak button now, and ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 6316.
Moved.
Thank you. No member has asked to speak against the motion, and therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 6316 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. Next item of business is consideration of two Parliamentary Bureau motions on designations of lead committees at Stage 1 of the Children and Young People Scotland Bill and at Stage 1 of the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill. Can I ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion numbers 6317 and 6318? Thank you. And the question on those motions will be put at decision time, to which we now come. Sorry, no, we don't. The next item of business is consideration of two Parliamentary Bureau motions on approval of SSIs, and I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion numbers 6320 and 6321.
And moved.
Thank you. And the question on those will be put at decision time, to which we now come. There are 7 questions to be put as a result of today's business, and I would want to remind members that if the amendment in the name of Kenny McCaskill is agreed to, then the amendment in the name of Margaret Mitchell falls. The first question then is that amendment number S4M 06306.2 in the name of Kenny McCaskill, which seeks to amend motion number 6306 in the name of Lewis MacDonald on access to justice, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, and therefore we will move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now, please. Order. The result of the vote on amendment number 6306.2 in the name of Kenny McCaskill is yes 62, no 49. The amendment is therefore agreed. The amendment and therefore the amendment in the name of Margaret Mitchell falls. The next vote is on the motion in the name of Lewis MacDonald. So the third question is that motion S4M 06306 in the name of Lewis MacDonald as amended on access to justice be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed and therefore we will move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now, please. Order. The result of the vote on motion number 6306 in the name of Lewis MacDonald as amended is yes 61, no 50 and there were 2 abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 6317 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the designation of a lead committee for the landfill tax Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion 6318 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the designation of a lead committee for the Children and Young People Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Sorry, I'm going to call that again, and could I ask if the Chamber could be silent? The next question is that motion 6318 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the designation of a lead committee for the Children and Young People Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion 6320 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI, the Welfare Reform Consequential Amendment Scotland No. 2 Regulations Draft be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion 6321 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI, the CRC Energy Efficiency Scheme Order 2013 draft be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to, and that concludes decision time. We will now move on to members' business, and could members who are leaving the chamber please do so quietly. I will allow a short pause to allow members to leave the chamber and